Hey guys, tonight we're curling up in a cold, drafty stone room surrounded by thick walls, the scent of burning peat and the quiet creaks of timber under medieval moonlight. If you have ever looked at a picture of a castle and thought, wow, that looks romantic, then congratulations, your fingers have probably never gone numb indoors, because medieval castles were not cosy at all. In fact, without central heating, insulation or double glazed windows, most of them were borderline unlivable in winter. So tonight we're asking a strangely overlooked question. How did people sleep in medieval castles without, freezing to death? Spoiler alert, you probably wouldn't survive this. But before we go full frostbite and start layering imaginary wool tunics, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It helps me keep making long, slow bedtime history for you, and I appreciate you being here. Also, what time is it where you are, and what city are you listening from? Always curious. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing at the entrance of a medieval stone fortress, let's say somewhere in northern England, maybe around the 13th century. The wind howls off the moors, the sky is gunmetal grey, and you're wearing, well, hopefully something woolen. As you step into the gatehouse, the air inside doesn't change much. That's the first thing people don't realise about castles. They're cold inside, colder sometimes than it is outside. Those thick stone walls, great for withstanding a siege, not so great at trapping heat. Castle builders prioritised defence over comfort. The stone was quarried locally, heavy, rough and often wet when freshly laid. In winter it absorbed cold like a sponge, and since most windows were basically glorified arrow slits, or, if you were fancy, covered in thin animal horn or oiled parchment, there was nothing resembling real insulation. No cosy alcoves, no soft drywall, just raw, brutal masonry from floor to ceiling. So the real question becomes not, how warm was it in there, but how the heck did anyone get any sleep at all? Let's head up a narrow spiral staircase, your torch flickering against the stone, and find your chamber. If you're lucky, red, noble, you might have a room to yourself. Sort of. The bedchamber was often attached to the solar, a semi-private living space for the lord's family. But it wasn't exactly a sanctuary. Cold draughts still slid through cracks in the stone. Mice scrabbled behind wooden panelling, if there was any. And at night, the temperature could easily drop below freezing. And yet people managed. Because they had to. Life wasn't about comfort, it was about survival. You adapt. Even in the grandest castles, rooms were designed for function, and that function was not feeling like a warm hug. Take Caernarfon Castle in Wales, massive, impressive, utterly chill-inducing. Rooms there were so frigid that nobles travelling from southern regions demanded extra servants just to haul in bedding and cloaks. Your breath fogged the air indoors. Stone fireplaces lined some walls, yes, but they were inefficient at best and dangerous at worst. We'll get into that later. Now imagine you're a castle servant. You're not sleeping in a chamber with a fireplace. You're on a pallet in the great hall, maybe curled near the hearth if you're lucky, with 5 other people snoring beside you. One of them kicks, one of them mutters in Latin. And your blanket smells vaguely like goat. Welcome to the Middle Ages, and yet for all this, people developed routines, systems, tricks, and the central trick was, don't sleep alone. Warmth came from proximity. Whether it was your family, your servants, or just a few dogs who weren't above snuggling for body heat. Personal space wasn't a thing. If anything, it was considered foolish to sleep by yourself unless you had a roaring fire, heavy drapes, and a bed stuffed with goose feathers. Speaking of which, the bed was a big deal. Even the simple wooden frames of poorer folk were raised off the ground, not for aesthetics, but for survival. Cold air settles. Sleeping on the floor meant courting frostbite, and in castles, the floor was often bare stone, maybe covered with rushes or straw that were swapped out when they became too rank with, well, medieval life. Now we can't talk about this without noting one of the most uncomfortable realities of medieval sleep. People just accepted the cold. There wasn't really another option. Cold was part of the air you breathed, the walls you leaned against, the beds you crawled into. To them, it was simply life. And they didn't sit around saying, gosh, it's chilly in here. They layered up, shared body heat, and figured out where the wind came through the stone so they could block it with something. Animal skins, draped wool, even their own cloaks. Here's a quirky fact for you. Some castle occupants reportedly slept with heated stones wrapped in cloth tucked under their bedding. Think of them like proto-hot water bottles, except they had to be heated in the hearth, carried carefully, and replaced before they cooled. And yes, sometimes they cracked and leaked soot or worse, but that was a small price to pay for not freezing solid by dawn. Now, what's debated among scholars, and this one's juicy, is just how cold it really was in some of these castles. Some argue that upper chambers stayed reasonably warm thanks to fires and tapestries. Others believe the chill was inescapable, and that most comfort came from mental fortitude, not actual temperature. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Some castles, especially later in the medieval period, had semi-insulated areas. Others, basically unheated bunkers with better views. So here you are, lying back on a mattress of straw, feathers if you're noble, listening to the slow crackle of fire and distant hoot of an owl. You're wrapped in 2 cloaks, wearing every layer you own, and someone else's toes are pressed against your shin. It's cold, but you're alive, and somehow asleep. You shift under the weight of rough wool blankets, and as the wind moans outside the castle walls, you start wondering what exactly you're sleeping on. Not just in or under, but literally what your body is pressing against right now. Because your mattress, unlike anything you're used to in the 21st century, is not full of memory foam or inner coils. It's probably full of straw. Or, if you're a bit fancier, feathers. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Bedding in medieval castles followed the strict lines of the class system. Like pretty much everything else, if you were a noble, you got the softest, warmest, most labour-intensive sleeping setup. But even then, it wouldn't come close to what we'd consider comfortable today. You lie back listening to the low snap of the fire and try to imagine the construction of what's holding you up. First, the base. For most people, the mattress was a simple sack. Think a big pillowcase, stuffed with straw rushes or hay. You'd fluff it up, lie down, and maybe you wish you hadn't, because straw shifts. It pokes, it gets lumpy, it moulds if it gets wet, it harbours insects. But it's what you've got. And if you're lucky, it's cleanish and freshly stuffed, not the same flattened husk that's been reused for a year and smells faintly of the stable. Now, if you're rich, and let's say tonight for fun you are, you might get feathers. Goose feathers were the preferred filler for noble beds, but duck or chicken feathers could do in a pinch. The feather-stuffed mattress, called a palliasse, would be laid atop a wooden bed frame raised off the ground. This keeps you warmer, yes, but also helps avoid those oh-so-charming castle rats that skitter across the floor at night, sniffing for crumbs or cosy corners. Next comes the bolster, a long, firm pillow that runs the width of the bed. It props you up slightly, helps with posture, and sometimes separates bedmates if you're not quite feeling the whole share body heat thing. After that, sheets, if you had them. Linen sheets were a luxury. They were painstakingly woven and washed, usually with lye and river water, then dried on hedges or grass, leaving them sun-bleached but still pretty scratchy. The average peasant or servant probably skipped sheets altogether. Too expensive, too fragile. The blanket situation, though, that's where things get serious. You could pile them on thick. Wool, more wool, layered cloaks, sheepskins, and if you were really fancy, imported textiles like Flemish cloth or dyed coverlets. But again, wealth was everything. Your lord might be wrapped in a brightly dyed woolen blanket with embroidery along the edges, while your servant is curled up under a thin layer that might have once been a curtain. And it wasn't just what you slept on or under, it was also where. You might think of a bedroom as a private space, but in castles, rooms were often multi-purpose. The main chamber could double as a receiving room, a workspace, or even a dining area during colder months. That meant your bed wasn't just for sleeping, it was a throne, a statement, and yes, a battlefield against the cold. Let's talk about the fringe fact of the night. In some cases, nobles didn't even sleep on their beds alone. Not just because of spouses, but because they often brought in guests, not those kinds of guests, though that happened too. More like important visitors, children, and even close servants who stayed nearby in case they were needed. The bed was big, crowded, and often noisy. Imagine falling asleep while someone 3 feet away snores like a warhorse. There's also the question of bedding maintenance. How do you clean all this stuff without a washing machine? Well, you don't. Or at least not often. Feathers were expensive and delicate, so the mattress was rarely cleaned, more likely just aired out. The outer bedding could be washed seasonally depending on access to water, soap, and free labour. And of course, bed linens were status symbols, clean ones especially, so people showed them off, literally paraded them around. Look at my dazzlingly white sheets, they seem to say, and know that I am better than you. But don't assume peasants just slept in filth. That's a popular myth, but even the working class had systems. Straw bedding might be refreshed every few weeks, with herbs like lavender or chamomile thrown in, not for romance, but to mask odour and repel pests. It wasn't five-star luxury, but it wasn't total squalor either. Now, here's where scholars get into a little back and forth. There's debate over just how soft medieval bedding really was for the upper class. Some historical inventories list feather beds, here silk coverlets, and beds of estate with velvet canopies and gold-threaded hangings. Sounds lavish, right? But others argue that these were showpieces, not for sleeping but for impressing. The actual beds used at night? Probably simpler, more functional, less embroidered. Think of it as medieval Instagram versus reality. Meanwhile, in the lower ranks of the castle, practicality ruled. Servants might sleep on simple sacks of straw rolled up and tucked into corners. They often reused cloaks as blankets and placed boots or tunics near the hearth to warm them for the next day. And if you were a page or squire, you'd be up before dawn anyway, so sleep was short, chilly and interrupted. Yet people made it work. They adapted to discomfort the way modern folks adapt to traffic, low Wi-Fi or bad coffee. You don't love it, but you deal. And in a cold stone castle, that meant learning to treat your bed like a survival pod. Layers mattered, proximity mattered. Knowing which part of the wall was least drafty definitely mattered. So as you lie there tonight, under the weight of scratchy wool and maybe one very affectionate cat curled at your feet, you start to understand something. It wasn't about luxury, it was about endurance. You didn't have to sleep well, you just had to sleep enough to get through another day of winter. You close your eyes, shifting, slightly to avoid the straw lump under your hip. It crunches softly like dry leaves. Outside, the wind hasn't let up, but your little cocoon, however primitive, is holding its own. Somewhere down the corridor, a door creaks. You stir under your heap of wool and feathers, eyes still half closed, and you realise something. You're not alone. Not in the spooky castle ghost way, though yes, we'll get to that later, but in the very literal, practical sense. Because in a medieval castle, sleeping was rarely a solitary activity, especially for the lower ranks. Welcome to the Great Hall crash pad, where rest isn't private but communal, noisy, and weirdly social. The Great Hall is the heart of the castle. By day, it's a bustling centre for meals, music, and business. But at night, it transforms. Torches dim, hearth embers glow, and suddenly it becomes a bedroom for dozens of people. Imagine sleeping in your office conference room after clearing off the table and tossing down a blanket. That's basically the vibe. You roll off your makeshift bedding and take a look around. The rushes on the floor, scattered hay, herbs, and sometimes old straw, are meant to soften the surface and soak up spills. In reality, they're itchy, probably damp, and may contain something that once belonged to a chicken. Still, they're better than cold bare stone. Servants, guards, kitchen staff, travelling minstrels. Everyone gets a spot in the Great Hall. Space is first come, first served, and if you're lucky, you've claimed a place near the fire. Not too close, embers can start cloaks smouldering, but close enough to feel some of the warmth before it fades around midnight. People bunch together. Feet stick out from cloaks. There's coughing, muttering, even the occasional dream shouting. It's like a giant human puzzle made entirely of snores, elbows, and woolen tunics. And yes, you're sleeping in your clothes. Everyone does. Night clothes exist, long linen shifts mostly, but they're reserved for the well-off or the meticulous. For everyone else, what you wore during the day is what you sleep in. Layered tunics, hose, maybe a cap to keep in the heat. It's not comfortable, but again, comfort isn't the point. Surviving the cold is. The lighting in the hall dims until there's just a glow from the hearth and a few guttering wall sconces. You pull your cloak tighter and lie back down, this time resting your head on a bundled-up tunic serving as a pillow. Someone a few feet away lets out a snort that echoes off the stone. You try not to laugh. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some castles kept their dogs indoors at night, not just for protection, but for warmth. If you're on good terms with the kennel master, you might get a hound to curl up beside you, radiating blessed body heat. On the flip side, if you're on kitchen duty, you might end up near the scullery door, where every gust of wind creeps in like a thief. People did what they could to carve out personal space. Maybe a bench to lean against, a curtain strung up for a little privacy. But in the Great Hall, privacy is relative. You can hear everything, the crack of someone's joints as they roll over, the soft fart of a dreamer nearby, the faint buzz of a noble upstairs shouting for wine, and yet, this is normal, expected, even comforting in its own strange way, because you're part of a group and warmth means numbers. Now, there's a running scholarly debate about how much time people actually spent sleeping in the Great Hall. Some historians argue it was only the lowest servants or temporary guests. Others suggest it was common for much of the household to bunk down there, especially in winter when heating individual rooms was impractical. The likely truth, it varied. Big castles with more resources could afford to house servants in attics or side chambers, but smaller or more utilitarian keeps, communal sleeping all the way. There's a rhythm to it. You start to doze, someone stokes the fire. A baby cries in the corner. Yes, even infants were bundled up and brought into the hall on cold nights, swaddled tight like burritos. The air smells like ash, wool and old stew. And under all that, something oddly earthy and human. A scent of shared existence, unfiltered. You shift again, trying to find a soft spot on the floor, and consider how people handled midnight needs in this setup. Quietly, mostly. Chamber pots might be tucked away behind furniture. Otherwise, it was a cold walk to the garderobe, the castle's privy. More on that nightmare later. Most people just held it till morning or didn't, which is why you don't walk barefoot in the hall, ever. The Great Hall wasn't just for lower-ranking folks, either. During festivals or feasts, even guests of some status might be offered a place here, especially if all the chambers were full. Picture it. You show up to a grand banquet, eat your fill, drink 3 too many goblets of spiced wine, and then are handed a bundle of linens and told, good luck finding a warm spot by the wall. Still, even in its roughness, the Great Hall served a purpose. It was central, relatively safe, and crucially it held heat better than upper floors. Warm air rises, yes, but so does cold air sink at night through old wooden beams. Plus, being close to the kitchen and the hearth gave this part of the castle a small advantage when it came to not dying of frostbite in your sleep. Let's not pretend it was charming, though. This wasn't a slumber party, it was survival. The air might get so cold your breath fogged, and waking up meant stiff limbs and frozen fingers. But then you'd rise, shake out your cloak and start the day, because that was the expectation. No complaints, just routine. Now imagine the same scenario in summer. The hall gets hot, stifling, and the same sleeping arrangement suddenly feels oppressive instead of cosy. People toss off layers, open wooden shutters if they can, and trade freezing winds for swarms of flies. You'd think warm weather would improve sleep, but ironically, it often just changed what made people miserable. So tonight, tucked among servants and strangers, you learn a truth about castle life. The cold was constant, but company was the real comfort. Whether by choice or by necessity, people slept side by side under shared blankets, around shared fires. It wasn't peaceful, but it worked. And when someone rolls over and steals half your blanket, you just grumble, pull your tunic over your ears, and drift back to sleep. It's sometime just before dawn now, the kind of deep, silent hour when even the fire forgets to crackle. You've made it through the night in the Great Hall, though your back's a little sore and your foot's been nudging a stranger's boot for the past hour. But now let's take the stairs up, higher into the castle, past the archways and stone corridors where torchlight flickers against worn tapestries. You're heading to a very different kind of sleeping space. The private bedchamber of a lord or lady. This isn't just any room, it's a symbol of power, of wealth and of warmth, kind of. Because let's not kid ourselves, even for the upper crust, castles were still glorified iceboxes, but the nobility had better tools and better strategies for keeping the chill at bay. You step through a heavy wooden door banded in iron. Inside is a room that actually feels intentional. There's a raised bed in the centre, tall and dramatic, draped in heavy curtains of wool or velvet. The walls are hung with embroidered cloths, not just for looks, but for insulation. Thick tapestries depicting religious scenes or family crests help trap body heat. A cosy workaround in a world without radiators. The bed itself is a bit of a marvel. Huge, for one. This isn't a twin mattress tucked in a corner. It's a grand wooden frame carved with Gothic detail, likely oak or walnut. The mattress is high off the ground, so high in fact, you might need a step stool to climb in. That's not excess, that's insulation strategy. Cold air hugs the floor, so the further away you are from it, the better your chances of not waking up with icicles on your eyelashes. The bedding is layered like a medieval lasagna. First, a straw mattress to act as the base, then a feather bed, soft and thick, followed by linen sheets, wool blankets, and possibly even fur coverlets. Rabbit, fox, or ermine, if you're extra fancy. And at the very top, the pièce de résistance, a canopy of thick fabric, drawn closed at night to create a microclimate of sorts. In the middle of a freezing room, this bed becomes a little heat bubble, a luxurious womb of warmth and status. You slide under the covers. It's dark, quiet. Maybe there's a low-burning brazier somewhere in the corner, or a small fireplace with coals that glow but no longer flame. The air is cold, but not bone-rattling. You curl your knees up and pull the blankets to your chin, much better than the rush-covered floor downstairs. Still, it's not just about warmth. This bedchamber is also a kind of throne room. Nobles didn't just sleep here. They conducted business, received close visitors, and occasionally held audiences. That bed, half of its function was symbolic. To be invited into it, literally or figuratively, meant intimacy, power, or favour. But even here, sleeping wasn't exactly luxurious by the modern standards. You'd still wear layers to bed, often a nightcap, sometimes gloves, maybe even boots if the floor was especially cold. And if your castle was particularly drafty, you might even wake up to frost on the inside of the window slits. Ever see your own breath in bed? Nobles did, regularly. Here's your quirky fact of the night. Sometimes servants would pre-warm the lord's bed using heated irons or metal pans filled with embers gently swept between the sheets. Sounds fancy, right? Until you realise that if the pan slipped or wasn't handled carefully, it could literally set the bed on fire. Medieval luxury was always a bit flammable. Now, unlike the Great Hall, this chamber offered a measure of privacy. But not total isolation. Many nobles shared their bed with someone, not always a spouse. It might be a favoured courtier, a bodyguard, or even a high-ranking servant. Again, it wasn't always about intimacy. It was about heat, safety, and social ties. Bed sharing in this context wasn't weird. It was normal. There's an ongoing academic debate here too, whether noble chambers were truly private in the way we understand the word. Some scholars argue that these spaces were as much public theatres as sleeping quarters. Others claim that as castles evolved, the noble bedchamber became more secluded and intimate. But the reality, as usual, falls somewhere in between. You are alone, but never really alone. Let's pause for a sensory moment. The bed creaks faintly as you adjust. Outside the arrow-slit window, the wind moans over the battlements. You can hear it slipping through the narrow stone opening, even with a wooden shutter latched in place. The air smells faintly of ash, wool and lavender, used often in noble chambers to mask the less glamorous castle scents. Your fingertips brush against embroidered linen. The fabric is coarse by modern standards, but beautifully made. You trace a little swirl in the stitching, something your lady's maid spent hours crafting by firelight. Even in this high-status cocoon, the cold is a presence. A shadow in the room, but it's held at bay, barely, by layers of cloth, clever architecture, and an entire domestic staff working behind the scenes to make this one room less unbearable than the rest. And about that staff, some would sleep just outside the door on pallets or benches, ready to be summoned. Others would rise before dawn to rekindle the fire, or lay out fresh clothing warmed by coals. A noble's sleep was serviced like a ritual, each layer of comfort built on someone else's labour. So you breathe in the darkness, warm beneath fur and wool, knowing you're insulated not just by fabric but by the hierarchy that placed you here. Somewhere below, in the freezing great hall, your steward rolls over on his straw pallet, and across the courtyard, a stable hand pulls a horse blanket over his shoulders. But here, in the Lord's bedchamber, sleep comes softer. Not because the room is truly warm, but because everything around you has been arranged, strategically, carefully, and historically, for the illusion of warmth. You close your eyes and listen to the last crackles of the hearth, the faint stir of wind against the tower walls. Sleep doesn't just arrive, it's summoned, layered, protected. You're waking up now, or maybe you never fully slept, and the first thing you notice is a faint golden glow sneaking in from the window slit. The second thing, your nose is freezing, like truly freezing. The kind of numbness that makes you wonder if it's still attached to your face. And yet the rest of your body is warm, almost stifling under the weight of blankets and furs. You blink up at the ceiling of heavy wooden beams and tug the coverlet a little higher. Welcome to the magical world of canopy beds, a medieval invention that was part bed, Part fortress against the cold, at first glance a canopy bed looks like a status symbol. 4 tall posts, ornate carvings, rich fabrics, embroidered curtains, and yes, nobles loved showing off, but under all that flair was a clever piece of climate engineering. These beds weren't designed to be pretty, they were built for survival. You shift beneath the covers and run your hand along the edge of the curtain. It's thick, woven from heavy wool or velvet, and when it's drawn it transforms the bed into a warm, tented cocoon. The curtains trap body heat, block out drafts, and create a microclimate inside. The larger the castle, the colder the room, so the bed became its own tiny, self-contained room within a room. Think of it like a medieval sleeping bag, but one that weighs 300 pounds and takes 6 servants to assemble. The canopy itself, that flat roof above the bed, wasn't just decorative either. It blocked falling soot from the ceiling beams, because yes, sometimes rodents, dust, or even the occasional stone flake would fall from the roof. Imagine waking up to a bit of rat dander in your mouth. No thanks. As you lie there in your royal cocoon, it's worth noting that canopy beds weren't reserved for the elite alone. By the later medieval period, even middle-class households had simpler versions, maybe less ornate but still functional. A basic wooden frame, a linen canopy, and woven drapes could mean the difference between waking up refreshed or waking up half-frozen and grumpy. And while we're here, let's pull back the curtains, literally, and peek at one of the more curious facts about medieval beds. They were often shared. Even in noble households, it wasn't uncommon for multiple people to sleep in the same bed. Sometimes that meant a spouse, sometimes children, sometimes visiting nobility or even favoured servants. A big bed wasn't just luxury, it was strategy. Body heat was the most reliable source of warmth, and humans are basically portable furnaces when you get enough of them in one place. Here's your fringe fact of the evening. In some households, a canopy bed was passed down through generations like a family heirloom, not just for its value, but because breaking it down and moving it was such an ordeal. We're talking hundreds of pounds of timber, hand-forged brackets, velvet curtains with real silver thread. Transporting a medieval bed could take multiple carts and several people. And yes, if you were travelling, you might bring just the curtains and linens and borrow a local bed frame, or sleep on the floor and curse your own wealth for being so heavy. The scholarly debate here gets into questions of function versus status. Were these elaborate beds primarily practical, or were they just the medieval version of Instagram furniture? Some historians argue the canopies were primarily for show, exaggerated displays of wealth and lineage, particularly when embroidered with coats of arms or religious iconography. Others insist they were purely functional, especially in frigid northern climates, where a poorly insulated castle could kill you. Most likely they were both. In the Middle Ages, practicality and performance often went hand in hand. Let's settle back under the covers and really feel it. The heat of your own breath warming the little space between your face and the blanket, the musty scent of wool, the heavy sconce broken only by the occasional pop of embers or distant echo of a gate being opened below. This is comfort, medieval style. Not because everything is soft or clean or peaceful, but because everything isn't. And yet you've managed to carve out a corner of warmth, privacy, and stillness inside a stone fortress designed for war. And even in this moment of relative luxury, you'd still be sleeping with layers. Not just blankets, but actual clothing. A linen shift, a woolen undershirt, maybe even hose if you were especially sensitive to the cold. Taking off all your clothes to sleep? That was madness. Only something done in summer, or in poetry, not in a room where the temperature could drop low enough to freeze the water left in a jug beside the bed. You glance toward the foot of the bed. In some chambers, there'd be a warming pan, a metal container filled with glowing embers passed between the sheets before bedtime. They left behind a trail of dry heat and the faint smell of scorched linen. Used incorrectly, of course, they were small disasters waiting to happen. But used right, they could make all the difference between a restful night and a miserable one. And when you think about it, the canopy bed was more than furniture. It was a lifestyle, a barrier between you and the harsh reality outside the curtains, a space where you could pretend, just for a few hours, that the world wasn't cold, chaotic, and occasionally full of screaming peasants and rebellious cousins. It was control, comfort, and warmth. You roll over slowly, listening to the gentle rustle of fabric. The bed frame creaks softly, and outside the first notes of birdsong filter in through the narrow window. It's still too early to rise, but already the castle is waking. Somewhere down the hall a servant is stoking the fire. Another is dragging in a bucket of water. sloshing ice chunks onto the floor. But for now, inside your thick-curtained bed, the cold is just a rumour, a whisper against the edge of your woolen world. You close your eyes again and let it fade. You wake again just as the sunlight really begins to filter through the high slit in the stone wall, a thin cold beam laying across your blanket like a blade of winter itself. You're stiff. Sure, your shoulder aches a little from lying on your side too long, but the bigger issue is the slow realization that it's cold. Colder than it was an hour ago, somehow. Your breath puffs visibly in front of your face. It curls up toward the canopy, lingers for a second, then vanishes into the shadows. And you realize the fire must have gone out. Time to do what every person in a castle dreads on mornings like this. Get out of bed. You lift the corner of the heavy coverlet and instantly regret it. The cold rushes in, slicing through your layers of linen and wool like you're wrapped in gauze instead of garments. Your toes curl reflexively as they meet the icy air. Every hair on your arm stands on end. But still, you swing your legs over the side of the bed. This is where you learn the true secret of surviving medieval winters. You don't sleep naked, you layer up or freeze. Most people today picture medieval folk sleeping in some romantic white nightgown, all flowing sleeves and embroidered collars, probably lit by candlelight and the soft sound of a lute in the distance. Yeah, no. While nightgowns did exist, especially for women of wealth or high status, they weren't delicate. They were functional, linen or wool depending on the season, and always designed with one thing in mind: heat retention. You're already wearing a long linen shift, probably a second woolen layer over that. Your legs are clad in wool hose, stitched tightly to trap warmth. If you're especially prudent or a chronic overthinker, you might also be sleeping in a pair of soft leather slippers or felted boots. And over everything, a nightcap, because if you've ever slept in a cold room, you know your ears are the first to go. And let's be real here. If you were truly desperate, you'd sleep in everything you owned. Cloaks, doublets, gloves, even a hood. Medieval people weren't concerned with looking good while they slept. They were concerned with waking up alive. So if you picture yourself curled up in your noble bed, swaddled in 6 layers and a fur-lined cape, looking more like a burrito than a person, you've got it right. Servants, of course, didn't get to dress quite so elaborately for bed. They often reused the same garments day and night. A tunic by day was a sleeping shirt by night. Wool cloaks doubled as blankets. And if you were lucky, you got to dry your socks by the fire before turning in, because there's nothing worse than cold, wet feet on a stone floor at 2 a.m. Let's not forget the peasantry either. Those who lived near the castle or worked within its walls but didn't sleep inside its fortified rooms. Their bedrooms were usually lofts above animals, which sounds terrible until you realise that livestock generate heat. A small cottage with a cow in the lower floor? That's free living insulation. People slept on platforms above pigs and goats and woke up warmer than some barons. Here's your quirky medieval fact of the night. Some people literally slept with animals. Not metaphorically, not romantically, just functionally. A small dog tucked under the blankets wasn't just a pet, it was a biological hot water bottle. And chickens, surprisingly warm. There are written accounts of families cuddling chickens in their bedding to share warmth during the most brutal winters. Think of it as the original weighted blanket, but feathered and sometimes noisy. Now, if you're wondering whether they ever overdid it with all this bundling, the answer is yes. There's a record of one English nobleman who wore so many layers to bed, including a leather belt for protection, that he had to be cut out of his clothing in the morning after he fainted from heat exhaustion. So yes, layering was key, but balance was essential. This leads us into a lovely academic tug-of-war over just how cold these castles really were. Some historians suggest that while the stone structures were drafty, the presence of tapestries, carpets and consistent fires kept them moderately livable, especially in well-staffed estates. Others argue that even the most extravagant castles were essentially giant refrigerators in winter, with isolated warm pockets that vanished the moment you left your bed or fire. Archaeological studies of castle walls and hearth placement offer evidence both ways. Some rooms were built with passive solar heat in mind, southern exposures, narrow windows, thick insulated shutters. Others were clearly designed by people who thought wind chill was a personality trait. But whether it was a bit nippy or actively trying to kill you, the outcome was the same. Medieval people dressed for bed the way you dress for a hike through the Alps. If you were poor, you learned how to survive it with what little you had. If you were rich, you threw money, servants, and firewood at the problem until you could fall asleep comfortably. Either way, sleep wasn't the luxurious Netflix and chill ritual it is now. It was a battle strategy, so here you are, finally up and out of bed, wrapped in 2 cloaks, your breath still fogging the air. You shuffle toward the brazier in the corner and give it a little poke with an iron rod. A few embers blink back at you, unimpressed. You sigh, wrap your blanket tighter, and consider calling for your servant to fetch more coals. But then again, they're probably still asleep on the cold floor outside your door. You peer out your narrow window. The courtyard below is covered in frost. A couple of guards are pacing in heavy fur capes, their boots crunching on the frozen stones. A stable boy leads a steaming horse across the cobbles, the animal's breath clouding in the early light. You're still groggy, still chilled to the bone, but you're up. And thanks to your linen shift, your woolen socks, and the dog-shaped furnace still curled at the foot of your bed, you're not frozen. Small wins, in medieval terms. The chill doesn't fade, it settles. It follows you across the room like a patient shadow, slipping beneath doorframes and curling between the flagstones, never in a rush, just there. You know what you need now, fire. Not just a few leftover embers and hopeful body heat, but a full crackling blaze that could make you feel human again. You glance at the fireplace in your chamber, a grand, soot-streaked structure carved from limestone, and instantly realise why sleeping near fire in a medieval castle was a blessing and a gamble. You pad over slowly, wool-wrapped feet silent on the floor. The hearth is big. Bigger than it needs to be, really, nearly as tall as you are, with a wide-open mouth framed by sewn pillars and black as night inside from years of soot and smoke. It's out now, of course, just a few sleepy coals and the whisper of heat that once was. The ash is soft and fine, a grey snowbank waiting to be stirred. But before you do anything, let's talk about why this fireplace exists in the first place, and what medieval people had to contend with when using them. Fire was the #1 way to warm a room, obviously, but it wasn't as simple as lighting a match and flipping a switch. Most castle fireplaces were shallow, with wide chimneys that did little to funnel smoke up and a lot to let wind and ash in. Some were poorly built, especially in older castles, designed more for grandeur than efficiency. Others had clever draft systems and hoods meant to channel smoke, but the truth? Even the best fireplaces were temperamental. You stir the ashes with an iron poker, trying to coax a little life from the coals. There's a faint glow, but not enough to light your socks on fire. Yet. You know from memory there should be a small stack of kindling tucked into a nook beside the hearth. Birch twigs, a few dry pine cones, maybe a sliver or two of hardwood that burns slow and hot. You add it gently, watching smoke curl upward in a lazy spiral. Here's where the romance ends. Fireplaces in castles were incredibly dangerous. Most weren't lined with modern fire brick, and chimneys could clog with soot, sometimes catching fire themselves. Sparks could leap out and land on a wool rug, a hanging tapestry, or, more horrifyingly, on your bed curtains, which, by the way, were often the most flammable objects in the room. Imagine being cocooned in a velvet-lined dream nest and waking to find the whole thing ablaze. Quirky fact time. One noblewoman in the 14th century actually survived such an incident by rolling herself in her bedsheets and flinging herself down a spiral staircase. She lived. The bed, however, did not. So despite the obvious benefit of warmth, people treated fire with suspicion. It was essential, but not to be trusted. Fires were rarely left unattended. If you were rich, you had servants whose job it was to tend it throughout the night, gently feeding it wood or adjusting the embers to keep the room temperate without triggering a full-blown inferno. If you were not rich, well, you slept lighter. This leads us to one of the more debated aspects of castle life. How often did people actually have fires in their bedrooms? Some historians argue it was reserved for the wealthiest nobles, and even then, mostly in winter. The cost of wood, the danger, and the labour involved made it impractical for daily use. Others believe that fireplaces were common in private chambers, especially in colder climates, and were used regularly, albeit with caution. What we know for sure is that even with a fire going, the warmth didn't travel far. Sit within 5 feet? Toasty. Move 10 feet away? Your breath still fogs. These fireplaces radiated heat unevenly, and that they lost much of it up the flue, which is why furniture in a noble's chamber was often grouped close together in a tight strategic circle around the hearth, and why beds were placed in corners, not for privacy, but to avoid the worst drafts. You finally manage to nurse the fire back to life. The twigs catch, pop, and crackle. Flames stretch upward, licking the old stone grate. You hold your hands out, palms open, and let the warmth soak in slowly. It's the kind of heat that feels almost emotional after a night of cold. The kind that reminds you you're alive, and it's not just for comfort. Fires in castles were functional. You could dry wet clothing beside them, warm up a stone to place under your blankets, or even heat a little iron dish of spiced wine or broth to sip before bed. You couldn't cook in your bedroom fire, but you could gently reheat something brought from the kitchen, assuming a servant was kind enough to risk the icy corridors to bring it. Some castles had central heating systems of a kind, hypocausts borrowed from ancient Roman designs, that funneled hot air under floors or through walls, but these were rare, expensive, and found mostly in ecclesiastical or royal residences. Your average castle relied on brute force, large fires, layered clothing, and careful room positioning. Which way did the room face? Was there a windbreak? Did the fireplace back against another hearth in the next room, so heat was shared? Castle architects thought of these things, even if their results were inconsistent. Let's take a quiet moment here. You sit beside the fire, the stone floor cold against your ankles, the flames flickering orange and gold against the chamber walls. You sip a little watered wine, lukewarm, but it helps. Outside, the wind rattles the shutter. Inside, the room breathes again, slowly, warmly. You remember last night, the bed curtains, the layers, the frozen breath. And now, this tiny pocket of heat you've managed to summon feels like a miracle. The kind of miracle that involves dry wood, decent kindling, and a bit of luck. This was medieval life, not glamorous, not romantic, just a series of little battles against discomfort, fought with ingenuity and stubbornness. The fireplace wasn't just an architectural detail, it was a lifeline, a dangerous, flickering, smoke-scented lifeline that could either save your night or burn down half your chamber. Still, you sit close, closer than you probably should, because warmth is addictive. And right now, it's the most luxurious thing in the world. The fire crackles, spitting the occasional ember that you gently nudge back with the poker. It's just starting to take hold now, enough to give the room that deep orange glow that softens the hard edges of the stone. You sit back on your heels and pull your cloak tighter. And that's when it happens. A knock at the door, too gentle to be urgent. A moment later it creaks open, and a sleepy face peers inside. One of your chamber servants, face still puffy from sleep, holding a bundle of fresh linens and, more importantly, news. "My lord," she says, "the steward requests your presence at breakfast." You nod, wave her in, and what you don't say is thank the gods someone else was warm enough to wake up first. As she shuffles about the room, pulling back the curtains from the bed, laying out a clean tunic, you glance toward the hearth. Another day, another frost. And just before the servant leaves, you notice what she's doing, setting up a low, straw-stuffed pallet near the foot of your bed. That's where she slept last night, on the floor, near the door, in case you needed anything in the night. And just like that, you're reminded of another strange truth about sleeping in medieval castles. People didn't sleep alone, not even the ones who slept alone. Because in this cold, cavernous world of stone and wind, warmth meant people, and in the absence of people, you might as well be sleeping outside. Let's talk about bed sharing. It wasn't just about comfort. It wasn't about affection. It wasn't even always about status. It was about not dying of exposure. Bed sharing in the Middle Ages was extremely common, not just for couples, but for siblings, servants, travellers, journeyers, and even strangers. Inns offered shared sleeping spaces, where you might be assigned a bed with someone you'd never met. It wasn't weird, it wasn't scandalous, it was just practical. In fact, it was so expected that not sharing a bed was often seen as antisocial, or suspicious. In castles, noble families often shared beds with younger children, especially in winter. Servants shared with one another in shifts, sometimes 3 or 4 to a mattress, and personal attendants? They might sleep on a nearby bench, stool, or fur rug, close enough to hear their master breathe, and just far enough not to make it awkward. You glance again at the pallet near your bed and try to imagine sleeping there, and it's thin, barely padded, but placed close to the wall where there's less draft. The servant probably curled up with a cloak and maybe a hot stone wrapped in cloth, one of those little medieval tricks passed down through generations. You know what it's like to sleep beside someone like that. The warmth slowly building between your bodies, the space under the blanket becoming its own private furnace. And here's the thing, people embraced it. The medieval mind didn't draw sharp lines between intimacy and practicality. Sharing a bed wasn't an invitation for anything beyond survival. Sure, sometimes romantic liaisons happened, But so did arguments, strolling, kicking, and blanket theft. People learned to live together in close quarters because they had to. Heat was a team sport. Want a strange little fact? In some noble households, even ambassadors or royal guests were offered a spot in bed with the lord or the lady of the house, not as a romantic gesture, but as a sign of trust and political alliance. Nothing said we're on good terms, quite like snoring shoulder to shoulder under the same fur coverlet. And among the lower classes, bed sharing was downright ordinary. A peasant family might all cram into a single bed in the winter. Parents, children, and sometimes even livestock. Not because they lacked beds, though they often did, but because spreading out meant spreading the heat too thin. Huddling together was the smart option, the only option. Of course, not everyone was thrilled about it. There are old letters and records of people complaining about their bedfellows, about how much they moved, talked in their sleep, hogged the blankets. There's even an account of a young nobleman refusing to share a bed with a knight he considered too sweaty and impolite. That said, he ended up sharing anyway. The cold doesn't care about your standards. Now here's a little academic debate to warm your morning. Some scholars argue that bed sharing in the medieval period wasn't just common, it was central to understanding medieval social bonds. Sleeping beside someone, they say, was a form of trust, even the power. A lord who let a servant sleep in the same room or in the same bed was signalling closeness, dependence, or favour. Others argue that it was purely logistical. Too few beds, too many bodies. The truth, probably both. Like most things in history, meaning layered itself over necessity. You pull your cloak tighter and wander down the hall still thinking about it. Somewhere in another wing, servants are stirring, and you can hear the clatter of pots, the low drone of conversation as people start their day. You pass an open door and catch a glimpse of a knight still half asleep in his chamber, sharing a narrow bed with his squire, both of them snoring in opposite directions. It's not unusual. No one comments, no one cares. You reach the stairs and feel a sudden gust of cold, updraft from the lower levels maybe. You quicken your pace, holding your hands to your face like a makeshift heater, and all you can think about now is how you'll get through another freezing night tonight. And the next, and the next. But at least you'll have a bed. Maybe even someone in it with you. Maybe not by choice, but by strategy. Because if there's one thing the Middle Ages understood, it's that surviving winter wasn't about space or solitude or luxury. It was about shared warmth, the kind that came from bodies, breath, and the knowledge that you weren't facing the cold alone. By now you've made it to the lower hall, your boots thudding softly on the worn stone stairs, and as you walk past the narrow windows that glow with the pale light of morning, you start to feel it, something subtle and instinctual. Not just the cold, which is ever present, but the way the day feels different now. This isn't a world run by clocks and alarms. No sunrise alerts, no 7 a.m. meetings, no to-do lists scribbled onto glowing screens. Instead, the rhythms of medieval life, and of medieval sleep, are ruled by something much older and much simpler. The sun. You've probably heard the phrase, going to bed with the sun. But in the Middle Ages, it wasn't just poetic, it was practical. Candles were expensive, firewood wasn't infinite, and artificial lighting, when it existed, was smoky, dim, and often more troublous than it was worth. So when the sun dipped below the horizon, people wrapped up their day and settled into the long, slow unravelling of the night. No late-night screen time, no scrolling until your eyes hurt, just the natural fade from light to dark, and with it, a slow return to stillness. You step into the solar, the upper room used by the lord and his family, and find it quiet. The fire has been banked, the tapestries hold in what warmth they can. A maid is sweeping up the rushes from the night before, and the smell of crushed lavender rises from the floor. In the stillness you realise that sleep itself, how people did it, was different then too. Here's the weird part. Medieval people didn't just sleep once, they slept in phases. It was called segmented sleep, and there's a solid chance you've accidentally done it yourself on a restless night. People would go to bed shortly after nightfall, say sometime between 7 and 9 p.m, depending on the season, and sleep for a few hours. This was the first sleep, or primo somno. Then, like clockwork, they'd wake up, on purpose. For an hour or two they'd be completely awake, not groggy, not tossing and turning, just up. What they did during this watch period depended on their role in the household. Some prayed, some read, if they were literate and had candlelight. Others talked, tended the fire, or even made love. There are medieval medical texts that actually recommend this period as the ideal time for intimacy or conception. since the body had rested but not cooled. Leave it to medieval science to get oddly specific about bedroom timing. Then after this quiet liminal hour, they drift back into their second sleep, or secundo somno, lasting until dawn or close to it. This was when dreams were said to come stronger, when the body, properly warmed and stilled, slipped into a deeper, more vivid state. You weren't supposed to fight these waking hours, you were meant to embrace them. They were, in a strange way, sacred. And it wasn't just the nobles or the monks who did this. Segmented sleep patterns appear in peasant diaries, religious records, or medical texts, you name it. Everyone, across class lines, seems to have followed this rhythm. The sun went down, sleep came in two halves, and the night was not just a pause but a ritual. Modern scholars have debated whether this was truly biological. Did people naturally fall into segmented sleep because of the darkness? Or was it cultural, a habit shaped by environment and necessity? The answer again is likely both. When you live without electric light and your entire schedule is dictated by the sun, your brain settles into rhythms we've long forgotten. You stroll past the shuttered window and glance at the sun outside, low, thin, watery. It's autumn, maybe early winter. The days are short, the nights are long, and in this world, long nights meant more time for sleep but also more time to think, to whisper, to stir coals and murmur prayers while the fire snapped beside you. Here's a fun, slightly bizarre fringe fact. Some medieval people actually liked the waking period between first and second sleep so much that they stretched it into something almost social. They'd visit neighbours, walk to nearby homes by lantern, or share wine and stories in a quiet hall before returning to bed. Night wasn't feared, it was embraced. A strange, gentle in-between where the world seemed softer. Of course, this wasn't universal. Life in a castle came with responsibilities, guard duty, chamber service, tending to livestock, or late-night arrivals. Some people didn't get to follow the two-sleep cycle. They slept in shifts, like modern nurses or night watchmen. And if you were a kitchen servant, odds were good you had to be up before dawn, prepping for the day before others stirred. But still, the idea of segmented sleep shaped medieval nights more deeply than most people realise. You think back to last night, when the fire faded, when the silence crept in. Maybe you woke for an hour or so. Maybe you stirred, stretched, pulled your cloak tighter, and watched your own breath fog in the moonlight. That moment, half-conscious outside of time, wasn't an accident. It was exactly what medieval people expected. It was part of the design. And maybe, just maybe, they were onto something. Because in those liminal hours between first and second sleep, there's a kind of peace we rarely allow ourselves anymore. No screens, no noise, just the rustlings of the blankets, the occasional creak of the wood, the quiet murmur of someone else stirring in their sleep. A time to reflect, a time to be between. You head toward the stairs again, passing a sleepy steward clutching a ledger, and he nods in that half-aware way of someone still blinking off his second sleep. You nod back, and somewhere in the back of your mind a thought lingers. Maybe we've got sleep all wrong now. Back then no one fought their rhythms. No one blamed themselves for waking up at 2 a.m. They just lit a candle, wrapped a cloak tighter, and waited for sleep to return like a friend knocking at the door. And when it did, it was softer, quieter, more forgiving. By now, the sun has cleared the misty horizon and is sending streaks of light across the castle's inner courtyard, illuminating patches of hoarfrost like scattered diamonds. You watch from a narrow window as a stable hand crosses the stones in brisk, sure steps, his cloak flapping in the wind like a flag of duty. Behind him, 2 kitchen boys are hauling buckets of water, arms straining, feet slipping on the icy ground. No one's really awake in the modern sense. They're moving, yes, but awake, that comes later. For now, it's still too cold for thoughts, too cold for full sentences, and yet nature doesn't wait. The day marches forward, people have things to do, and in the middle of all this, you find yourself faced with the strangest and most unforgiving medieval question of all. What happens when you have to pee in the middle of the night? Yep, it's not glamorous, but it's real. Because even if you've bundled up like a wool-wrapped mummy, and even if you've survived the icy fingers of wind crawling through the window cracks, at some point, your body is going to betray you. And when it does, you're going to have to face the terrifying logistics of nighttime bathroom routines in a medieval castle. First things first, there are no toilets, no heated bathrooms, no cosy little side rooms with flushing porcelain and lavender-scented hand soap. If you're in the Lord's chamber, or even in a modest private room, you've probably got access to a chamber pot. It's a ceramic or metal bowl placed discreetly under the bed or in a corner, with a lid that tries and fails to keep the smell contained. When the time comes, you shuffle over, kneel down, and hope your aim's as good as you think it is. All while wrapped in layers of stiff linen and wool, possibly with a belt you forgot to untie in your sleepy panic, and heaven help you if the pot's already been used once or twice that night. Some nobles had a servant, often called a groom of the stool or a night servant, whose job included emptying these charming little vessels in the morning. Glamorous, right? And yes, before you ask, people did use chamber pots for more than just urination. And yes, they were emptied into larger containers, into cesspits, or in some cases, brace yourself, simply tossed out of a window, ideally, but not always, into the moat. Hence the phrase "gardilou," a warning yell used in some medieval cities to alert unfortunate passers-by that gravity was about to deliver a message. But what if you didn't have a chamber pot? What if you were sleeping in the Great Hall, or on the floor of a servant's chamber, or in a corner of the kitchen under a cloak? Then you had two options, both terrible. You either held it and suffered, or you braved the cold stone corridors and made your way to the guardrobe. Let's talk about guardrobes for a moment. These were the medieval version of a castle latrine. Usually built into an exterior wall, they were small, narrow chambers, sometimes no more than a stone bench with a hole in it, that dropped straight down into a pit or, in many cases, directly into the moat. There was zero privacy, zero insulation, and a significant draught that made every visit feel like a slap in the face from the North Wind himself. Some guardrobes were communal, others were attached to noble chambers, but all shared one thing in common. They were awful. The cold, the smell, the occasional rat, and, if you were very unlucky, frozen deposits on the stone. In winter especially, the idea of leaving a warm bed to squat over a freezing, wind-whistling hole in the dark wasn't just unpleasant. It was borderline traumatic. That's why people got creative. Some used wooden commodes with lids and removable pots. Others had elaborate chamber stools, especially in wealthier households, that looked like furniture until, well, they were opened. And then there were the ever-practical servants, who just found a quiet corner, handled their business, and cleaned it up before anyone noticed, if they noticed. Here's a quirky fringe fact that'll stay with you forever. Some medieval people believed that holding in urine or feces too long could lead to insanity or death. Not because they understood bladder infections, mind you, but because of medieval medical theories about the four humours. Everything had to be in balance, so if you were walking around full of corrupt humours with no release, clearly you were heading for a very dramatic, slightly tragic end. So when nature called, you answered. Even if it meant tiptoeing barefoot across ice-cold flagstones at 2 a.m, there's a scholarly debate over how much privacy was actually valued in these routines. Modern minds tend to recoil at the idea of using the bathroom in shared quarters, but medieval folks were less precious about it. Modesty existed, yeah, especially among the upper classes and clergy, but function usually trumped privacy. People grew up watching others relieve themselves, nurse babies, or change clothing in close quarters. The body wasn't taboo, it was just part of the background noise of life. You think about this as you move through the corridor, cloak wrapped tightly around your shoulders, passing a wooden bench where a young kitchen boy is curled up with a chicken, nestled beneath his tunic for warmth. Somewhere nearby, someone clears their throat. The castle breathes and stretches and wakes in pieces. Later, of course, the chamber pots will be carried down the servants' stairwells, emptied discreetly into the cesspit, or down a chute designed for just that purpose. The garderobes will be cleaned or not, and someone will toss a handful of herbs across the rushes to try and outsmell the whole affair. But in the middle of the night, when you're fumbling with a linen shift, hoping not to spill a cold metal bowl on your own feet, all of that doesn't matter. All that matters is not freezing, not falling, and not accidentally stepping into someone else's mistake. You return to your room now, grateful for the fire that still burns in the hearth. You shiver, slide back into bed, and wrap the covers around you like armour. Because even in a world of lords and ladies, stone towers and soaring arches, the nighttime routine remains strikingly human. Cold, clumsy, a little embarrassing, and absolutely essential. You're awake again, but this time not because of cold feet or medieval plumbing. No, this time it's something softer, subtle, almost beautiful. As the sun continues its slow, reluctant climb above the horizon, the castle comes alive with sound. Not loud or sudden, but muffled and rhythmic. The shuffle of boots on stone, the clink of buckets being carried, and faintly, ever so faintly, the whisper of fabric stirring against stone walls. You pull the covers up a little tighter and glance toward the far end of the room. There it is again, that sound, not footsteps, not voices, but something rustling. Curtains. You sit up slowly and take in your surroundings with fresh eyes. The room, once blank and stony in the half-light, is now gently transformed. Thick patterned hangings cover the walls, deep reds and golds, forest greens and navy blues. Worn and faded at the edges, but still vibrant in places. They hang like enormous blankets, lining the walls of the chamber like insulation. Not decorative fluff, but a calculated defence against winter. These are winter curtains and wall hangings, and they are the unsung heroes of castle warmth. From a distance they're pretty. Up close, they're functional, heavy wool, layered linen, sometimes even fur. Tapestries weren't just there to show off biblical scenes or family heraldry. They were the medieval version of thermal wallpaper. Because when the wind hit those outer stone walls, and it always did, these massive fabric panels were the only thing standing between your bedchamber and the bite of the elements. You slip out of bed and shuffle toward the wall. The hanging sways slightly as you pass, like it's breathing with the room. You press your hand against it, and behind the thick fabric you can feel the stone, ice cold to the touch. Without the wall hanging, your entire chamber would be one long draught, and you'd be lying in bed wondering why your teeth were chattering despite 4 layers of bedding. People today think of castles as grand, opulent places, and in many ways they were, but underneath the luxury they were clever machines for surviving climate. Wall hangings weren't decoration, they were technology, early home insulation, and for the people who spent their nights curled up in these drafty towers, they weren't optional. You cross the room, passing more of these tapestries, some are stiff with age, others soft and recently repaired. Most of them were hung during the colder seasons and taken down when the days grew warmer. There were different kinds for different functions. A thinner, decorative tapestry might live above a hearth or behind a chair, but the serious ones, the winter curtains, those were backed with wool or fur, sometimes even leather, and hung along exterior walls, windows, and draught-prone corners. Sometimes they were suspended on rods, sometimes tacked directly into the stone. In a few wealthier households they were custom-sized for each room, trimmed with velvet or dyed with rare pigments, reds made from crushed insects, blues from lapis lazuli. And yes, that meant some of these glorified blankets were worth more than a peasant's yearly wages. But let's not get distracted by price tags. What mattered was that they worked. Here's a fun fact to toss into the cosy mix. There were even specific textiles known as arras, named after the French town famous for their production, which were so synonymous with wall hangings that Shakespeare himself would later use the term. You might remember the infamous scene in Hamlet where Polonius hides behind the arras. What he was hiding behind was a heavy wool tapestry. Possibly wool, definitely draft resistant. Not the worst place to eavesdrop, or get stabbed apparently. But wall hangings weren't just for nobles. You'd find versions of them in less prestigious homes too, though they might be simpler, rougher, more practical. In a castle kitchen, for example, you might find an old wool curtain nailed over a doorway to keep heat from escaping. In a servant's chamber, perhaps a patched-up old tapestry covered the single window, keeping the wind from whistling straight into the room. Function over form, always. And while they did their job, wall hangings also played another role, quiet. A stone room echoes. It amplifies. Conversations, footsteps, arguments, even on prayers, everything bounces off the walls like a voice in a cave. But with tapestries in place, the room changes. The acoustics soften. You can whisper and not worry that the entire hall will hear you discussing your cousin's very suspicious hunting accident. It added not only warmth, but privacy. Some scholars suggest that tapestries also absorbed smells, which if you've ever visited a livestock-adjacent village in midwinter, you know is not a minor benefit. The wool and cloth fibres would absorb some of the cooking smoke, body odour, and the general mustiness of castle life. It wasn't a perfect fix, but it helped. There's a bit of an ongoing academic spat about whether these hangings were a sign of wealth first or practicality first. Did people cover their walls because it was warm or because it looked elite? The answer, like most things in medieval life, is yes. If you were rich, you showed off, but you didn't show off with something useless. You picked a status symbol that also kept you from freezing. And if you were poor, you copied the idea in the most affordable way possible. A plain wool blanket, dyed with onion skins, nailed to the inside of your cottage. You run your hand along the edge of one hanging. It's old, edges fraying, embroidery half faded, but there's something comforting about it. A textile that's seen generations of sleepless nights, harsh winters, secret conversations, and maybe a few things you're better off not knowing about. You step back toward the bed and let the curtain fall still behind you. The room is warmer now, not because the fire is stronger, or because the sun has suddenly decided to be useful, but because the walls are wrapped in something ancient and thoughtful. Cloth armour against the cold, and when night falls again, and the wind howls over the battlements and under the door, you'll be glad those hangings are there. Holding the warmth, holding the silence, holding the night at bay. You spend the day as best you can, layered in wool, avoiding the worst of the drafts, eating hot porridge that's somehow both too thick and too thin at the same time, and now the sun is falling once more, slipping behind the battlements in that lazy, golden way it does in winter. The temperature begins to drop again, not all at once, but in steadily, as if the air itself is exhaling. And with it, the castle shifts. The servants move faster, torches are lit, heavy doors are pulled shut, and quietly, without announcement, the building begins preparing for the night ahead. You've made it back to your chamber, tugging your cloak tighter around your shoulders. The fire is already going. It's not roaring, but someone's clearly thought ahead and laid it with care. You feel the heat before you even see the flames, and as you glance toward the door you notice something else. A small bedroll just to the side, low to the ground, right next to the threshold. A little nest of straw, a thin blanket, and a shape curled beneath it, breathing softly. Your servant. You stand still for a moment, watching the subtle rise and fall of their body. They're sleeping there not because there wasn't room elsewhere, but because it's their job, because this is what servants often did in castles, sleep by the door like quiet sentinels, half resting, half waiting. It's one of those small unspoken systems of medieval life. Nobles had bedchambers, nobles had beds, but they also had attendants, pages, chambermaids, squires, who stayed close by, often within arm's reach. Not for companionship, and not always for warmth, but for function. If you woke in the night in need of more blankets, a warm drink, or to be reminded what day it was, they were there. If the wind blew open a shutter or a rat scurried too close to your bed, they'd hear it before you did. Their presence was expected, constant, and rarely acknowledged. They weren't always in the room, of course. Some nobles preferred solitude, or at least the illusion of it. But in colder months, especially in draft-prone towers and chambers high in the castle, sleeping by the door wasn't just convenient, it was strategic. Servants, by sleeping near entrances and stairwells, acted as living insulation. They blocked cold air, they buffered sound, and, if the worst happened, if there was an intruder, a fire, or a sudden illness, they were the first to react. You move across the room, soft steps on old wood, and add a log to the fire. It sparks, pops, and sends a brief wave of warmth up your arm. Your servant doesn't stir, they're used to this, used to noise, to footsteps, to waking instantly if their name is whispered. There's something strange about it, isn't there? In modern life, the idea of someone sleeping beside your door would feel invasive. But in a castle, it's security, it's structure, it's trust. And in a world with no electric lights, no intercoms, no cell phones, proximity was everything. Help had to be within arm's reach, otherwise it might as well not exist. Let's be clear, these sleeping arrangements weren't luxurious. The servant's bedroll is thin, their blanket little more than a cloak with pretensions. If they're lucky, they have a sheepskin or wool pad underneath them. If they're really lucky, the wind doesn't slip through the door tonight and rattle their bones until morning. But even so, there's a certain honour in it, a role to play, to be the quiet watcher, the last line between noble comfort and whatever the cold might carry in. Now for your curious medieval tidbit of the evening. Some households went even further with this arrangement. In certain royal courts there were rotating shifts of chamber attendants who would sleep in the room but never sleep fully, dozing lightly in chairs or on cushioned benches with one eye open and one hand on their belt dagger. They were known to sit upright, barely covered, because lying down implied they might really fall asleep, and that wasn't acceptable. And if you think this kind of human surveillance sounds intense, you're not wrong. But when you live in a world where most deaths happen in the night, by illness, by fire, by surprise attack, you start to value those silent figures curled up by your door, more than all the furs and featherbeds in the world. There's a small scholarly debate about how common this practice was across Europe. Some argue it was mostly a high-status phenomenon, something seen in royal or aristocratic households with a surplus of staff and ceremony. Others suggest that even modest castles or manors had at least one retainer sleeping near the master's chamber during coldest seasons or times of unrest. Regardless, the image is clear. In the still hours of the medieval night, someone was always awake, or almost awake, always listening, or always ready. You sit back on your own bed now, the firelight flickering across the ceiling. You glance again at the door. The servant has shifted slightly, turning over and tugging the blanket tighter around their neck. You don't say anything. You don't need to. The night deepens. Elsewhere in the castle, similar scenes unfold. In the great hall, a steward curls on a bench beneath a moth-eaten tapestry. In the kitchens, a scullery maid sleeps beside the hearth, warming her toes in the ashes. In the tower above you, a guard leans against the stone, nodding between patrols, his breath fogging in the moonlight. And just outside your chamber, between you and the hallway where winter rides the draught like a thief, one silent figure lies still. You'll sleep well tonight, not just because of the fire, not just because of the blankets or the thick curtains holding the cold at bay, but because someone else is keeping watch. You wake up slowly, groggy, limbs stiff, breath misting into the early morning cold, and before you even move, you feel it again. That familiar ache in your toes, the creeping chill working its way down your spine like a dripping icicle. You blink at the ceiling beams overhead and sigh. Another day, another low-level battle with the weather. But as you slowly sit up, shaking the sleep from your limbs, something occurs to you. Through every section of this frozen medieval experience, from rush-strewn floors to roaring hearths to bed-sharing body heat, one humble material keeps showing up. Not silk, not velvet, not even fur, but something less glamorous and infinitely more useful. Wool. Yes, plain, scratchy, miracle-performing wool. The true unsung hero of the Middle Ages. You might think of it as just the sad cousin of cashmere or that thing your grandma knit into uncomfortable sweaters. But here, in this stone-cold castle where survival is a daily strategy, wool is everything. From socks to blankets to sleeping tunics, wool isn't just a textile, it's a lifestyle. You stand now, feet hitting the stone floor with a little jolt, and the first thing you do is reach for your chausses, tight-fitting woolen hose that you awkwardly wrestle up each leg like medieval yoga pants. They're stiff, they're itchy, and they have a distinct smell that suggests they've been worn 1 or 10 too many times without a proper washing. But they're warm. Gloriously, functionally warm. And that's enough. Next comes the undertunic, also wool, then the overtunic. Guess what? Wool. You throw on a cloak, thicker, darker, slightly damp from yesterday's walk to the stables, and again, yes, wool. The only part of your ensemble that isn't wool is the leather belt you cinch at the waist and the thin linen shirt underneath that barely qualifies as insulation. Everything else? One big wearable sheep. And you're not alone. Wool is everywhere in the castle. The bed linens are wool, the tapestries lining the hallways, wool, the blankets thrown over the backs of chairs, wool again. It's not just about material, it's about survival. Wool has this magical quality. It stays warm even when it's wet. And let's face it, in a world without central heating or dryers or weatherproofing, everything is always just a little bit wet. You walk out of your chamber and head down a side corridor, the wool of your cloak brushing against the stone wall. The torches aren't lit here yet, and it's just cold enough that your breath trails behind you in little clouds. Passing a small room used by the castle laundress, you hear the unmistakable slap of wet cloth being beaten against a board. Brave soul. It's barely dawn and she's already working with freezing water. You make a mental note to thank her, or at least nod at her like a normal, emotionally restrained noble. Here's a strange little fact that might make you appreciate your socks a bit more. Wool was so essential that laws were actually passed to protect its production. In England, the wool trade was the backbone of the economy for centuries. So much so that members of Parliament in the 14th century were required to sit on cushions stuffed with English wool during their sessions, not for comfort. It's a literal patriotic statement. Imagine showing your political allegiance by resting your rear end on a national resource. But wool wasn't just economic or political, it was deeply personal. Every layer you wore told a story. The thickness of the weave, the quality of the dye, even how finely it had been spun. A dark, coarse cloak said stable boy. a brightly dyed and neatly embroidered tunic that said wealthy merchant or minor noble with feelings about colour coordination. Wool signalled class, occupation, and most importantly, preparedness for the cold. Let's talk socks, because let's be honest, nothing ruins your entire medieval day faster than cold feet. Woolen socks were common but not always separate from the hose. Some were built into the leg coverings, others were simply wrapped strips of cloth tied around the feet. There were even records of people stuffing extra wool into their shoes, layering it like padding. And those who could afford it might wear 2 pairs, one for insulation, one for durability. Because medieval roads were brutal, boots were questionable, and frostbite was not fashionable. And yet, for all its usefulness, wool wasn't exactly cuddly, at least not at first. Unless it was carefully processed, cleaned, carded, spun and woven with skill, wool could be rough, stiff, and as welcoming as a kitchen scouring pad. That's why so many peasants and labourers looked perpetually itchy. Their wool was practical but not refined. Nobles, meanwhile, had access to finer grades, softer wool from young sheep, sometimes even blended with linen or silk to soften the feel without losing the heat. There's a scholarly debate about just how universal wool use really was across different medieval regions. Some argue that in warmer climates like southern France or the Iberian Peninsula, wool was seasonal at best. Others suggest that even there nights were cold enough, especially in stone houses or your highland regions, to require at least some wool garments. But in northern Europe, in castles like this one, wool wasn't seasonal, it was a year-round religion. You make your way toward the Great Hall, your cloak swirling behind you, and everywhere you look, wool is working. It's slung over benches, draped across sleeping bodies, wrapped around infants in makeshift slings. Even the hunting dogs curled up near the hearth wear crude little wool coats stitched by bored maids with scraps from worn-out tunics. It's not cute, it's necessary. And here's a quirky side note. Wool wasn't just for clothes. In some households it was used to plug drafty windows, rolled into ropes and wedged between the gaps in stone, stuffed into cracks in wooden doors. People even slept with balls of wool tucked inside their bedding, not for sewing but to act as tiny heat retainers. Medieval DIY at its finest. You finally settle near the hearth, grateful for the warmth, and glance down at your hands. They're red, dry, cracked from days of cold air and rough cloth. But you pull your sleeves down, tuck your fingers into the folds of your cloak and smile anyway. Because despite the chill, despite the aching bones and endless layers, you know you'll make it through the winter. All thanks to wool, evening comes again, slow and grey, settling over the castle like a damp wool cloak. The light thins, the air sharpens, and with it comes a new rhythm, one less frantic than the daytime hustle, but no less deliberate. The castle is quiet now in a different way, not silent but subdued. Meals are done, torches flicker along the corridors, someone somewhere is softly tuning a lute, and the kitchen smells have given way to the clean, smoky scent of banks of coals being readied for the night. And for many in the castle, especially those lucky enough to be in the higher chambers, it's time to prepare for bed. But this isn't just a matter of crawling under a blanket. In the medieval world, sleep was medicine. You stretch your legs by the hearth, your feet wrapped in thick wool socks that have lost none of their scratch but all of their structural integrity. A cup of hot ale sits by your side, steeped with rosemary and sage. It tastes like earthy soup mixed with regret, but you're drinking it anyway. Because according to medieval physicians, this blend is good for the humours. It calms the stomach, eases the spleen, maybe even wards off melancholia, though frankly, the flavour alone might be enough to distract you from whatever's bothering you. Medicine in the Middle Ages wasn't just leeches and bleeding, it was daily ritual, routine, the careful management of sleep, diet, air and emotion. Sleep in particular was considered sacred, not just necessary but curative. The body couldn't heal, grow or stay balanced without it, and people took it seriously, at least they did if they could afford to. You shift in your chair and watch as your steward sets out the bed for the night, smoothing the linen sheet, fluffing the feather mattress, and placing a small bag of dried lavender and wormwood near the pillow. The scent is sharp and bitter, but oddly calming. This isn't just for comfort, it's medicinal. Wormwood was believed to ward off bad dreams, lavender to soothe the nerves. Sleep was viewed as a portal, not just into rest, but into a kind of internal alchemy. You weren't just closing your eyes, you were rebalancing your soul. Now, if you happen to consult a medieval physician, or more likely if one was inflicted upon you, they'd have a lot to say about how you should sleep. First, you should eat a warm, moist supper. Nothing too spicy, no red wine, maybe some porridge or a soft egg. Then you should avoid troubling thoughts. No arguing, no poetry, no heavy books, especially anything in Latin. You might also take a short walk, wrap your feet in hot cloths, and sit near a small fire to draw heat into the body's core. Only then should you go to bed, and not immediately to sleep, mind you, but to recline thoughtfully. Lying on your left side was discouraged. It was said to tax the heart and the liver. The right side, on the other hand, was the warm side, believed to promote better digestion and dreamless sleep. Stomach sleeping? Absolutely out of the question. Back sleeping? Acceptable if not ideal. And if you snored, well, the medieval medical community had a charming theory that snoring was caused by an excess of phlegm, which could only be cured by certain herbs or, in extreme cases, bloodletting. You pull your cloak tighter and glance at the herbal sachet on your pillow. You're not entirely sure if it's meant to encourage restful dreams or exorcise a spirit, but either way it smells expensive and that's enough. Here's a strange and slightly delightful fact. Monks, who are held up as the gold standard of discipline and routine, often had highly regimented sleep patterns dictated by medical theory and spiritual necessity. In some orders, they were allowed no more than 5 hours of sleep per night, broken up by multiple prayer services. But despite this brutal schedule, even monasteries made room for small luxuries. Fur-lined sleeping hoods, heated stones, and medicinal teas prepared just before matins. And the laity weren't left out of this system. Folk medicine, passed down orally among villagers and lower castle staff, offered it its own sleep aids, crushed poppy seeds mixed with honey, warm ale steeped with chamomile, or a bit of boiled lettuce water, yes, really, taken before bed to cool the mind. There's an ongoing academic discussion about how widespread and effective these sleep rituals really were. Some argue that the prescriptions laid out in medical texts were only followed by the wealthy or educated. Others point to folk traditions and household recipes as evidence that medicalized sleep was common across all levels of society, adapted, of course, to what ingredients and knowledge were available. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. A noble might have a bespoke sleep regimen involving imported spices and learned physicians, while a peasant might swear by a warm rock and a prayer to St. Dymphna, patroness of sleep disorders. You begin to wind down now, the fire's low, the cup is empty, and your body, though still cold around the edges, is growing heavy. But your mind lingers on something. The idea that in a world where death was never far and medicine was as likely to harm as to heal, sleep offered a rare kind of hope. A reset. A belief that in the quiet darkness of night, your body could find its own balance. And maybe that's why so many people embraced those long hours of rest. Not just because they were tired, but because sleep was one of the only forms of medicine that actually worked. You rise, finally, and slip into bed. The mattress creaks softly under your weight. You tuck the sachet beneath your pillow, pull the thick wool coverlet to your chin, and curl onto your right side, just in case. Outside, the wind taps gently at the shutters. Inside, the fire whispers, and your body, wrapped in warmth and ritual and lavender-scented optimism, begins its nightly work, to rest, to heal, to dream. The first thing you notice is silence, not the kind you get in an empty room, or when the wind dies down, but a deep, carved-out stillness that feels older than the stones around you. You stir under the covers, the mattress shifting with a quiet creak, and realise it's still night, or very early morning. You're not quite sure. The fire has gone out completely, leaving the chamber in a blanket of darkness so complete it feels thick enough to touch. You open your eyes, but it hardly matters. Everything is black. But you're not afraid, because in this moment, what you feel isn't unease, it's reverence. Sacred quiet. The kind that only really exists in a place like this. A cloister. A monastery. Somewhere deep inside the spiritual engine of medieval life, where people slept not for comfort, but as part of a holy rhythm. This isn't your noble chamber. Tonight, you're stepping into colder territory. Thinner blankets, firmer beds, deeper silence. Welcome to the cells of the monks. Unlike the castle's grand towers and bustling great halls, monasteries were designed for stillness. They weren't built for entertaining guests or holding court. They were built for contemplation, humility, and the pursuit of eternal salvation through routine. and few routines were more strictly observed than those surrounding sleep. Because here, in these narrow stone rooms tucked behind chapel walls, sleep was sacrificed. You rise slowly from the rough woolen blanket and place your feet on the floor. Cold doesn't even begin to describe it. The stones feel like they were pulled from a glacier. You wince, not dramatically, just enough to remind yourself you're human. The cell is tiny, no more than 6 feet long, perhaps 4 feet across. Just enough room for a narrow cot, a stool and a tiny wooden shelf bearing a worn candle stub and a crucifix. The bed isn't really a bed. It's a plank frame with a thin straw mattress, coarse and uneven, stuffed with dry rushes, and maybe a few clumps of whatever filler the brother assigned to bedding could scavenge. No feather pillows, no thick quilts, just the basics, a woolen blanket, a stiff sheet, and whatever warmth your own body can produce. And a hooded habit, of course, which you never truly remove. Monks slept in their robes, always ready to rise at a moment's notice for prayer, study, or the occasional 3 a.m. spiritual emergency. Because here's the thing. Monks didn't get a full night of sleep, not even close. In most medieval monastic orders, sleep was broken into segments by the Liturgy of the Hours, a strict schedule of daily prayers that started before dawn and continued throughout the day and night. The first bell, matins or vigils might ring as early as 2 a.m. That meant rising in the dark, filing silently into the chapel, and chanting psalms for over an hour in the freezing cold, with nothing but candlelight and breath-clouded air to mark the passage of time. You shiver just thinking about it, but it wasn't just physical discomfort. It was intentional. The deprivation of sleep, the monotony of chanting, the repetition of words and movement, it was all part of the training. A monk was meant to master the body through discipline. Sleep was allowed only as much as it served that goal. Too much sleep was considered sloth, too much warmth, vanity, too much comfort, temptation. The ideal night's rest was short, humble, and quiet. Some monks even slept sitting up with their backs against the wall and hands folded in prayer. Others lay down fully but wrapped themselves so tightly in their robes that they resembled statues. And yet, even in this extreme discipline, there was variation. Benedictines were relatively lenient, allowing 6 or 7 hours of sleep when possible. Cistercians were stricter, often limiting rest to 4 hours or less. Split in 2 parts by prayer, and if you were sick, if you couldn't sleep, well, the medieval monastic world had remedies, some helpful, others less so. Warm goat's milk, a bit of honey, infusions of valerian or poppy, but more often than not insomnia was seen as a spiritual issue, a test, a punishment, or occasionally a divine gift. After all, saints didn't need sleep, they needed visions. Here's your quirky fringe fact of the night. One monk in the 12th century reportedly trained himself to sleep in 10-minute bursts throughout the day and night, claiming it had left more time for copying manuscripts. He was praised for his restless devotion. Modern researchers, meanwhile, might label him deeply sleep-deprived and likely hallucinating by Thursday. There's a scholarly debate about how sustainable this lifestyle really was. Some argue that these sleep routines were more aspirational than actual, that most monks tried to wake for night prayers but often dozed through the bell or nodded off mid-psalm. Others believe the rigid schedules were enforced strictly, with punishments for slackers ranging from extra chores to fasting. Most likely it varied by location, abbot, and the individual monk's constitution. But one thing is certain, sleep in monastic life was not for pleasure. It was a tool. You imagine the room again, the cell, the cold, the echo of bare feet down a cloistered hallway. You can almost hear the low chant of voices rising from the chapel, blending into one slow, solemn wave. You picture a monk waking from that thin, uncomfortable cot, eyes puffy, lips already moving through a memorized psalm. No complaining, no hesitation, just movement, prayer, devotion. And yet even in that starkness there's peace, a simplicity, the kind that makes the harshness of the room feel almost holy. The absence of comfort becomes somehow its own comfort. You sleep less, you sleep hard, but when you do, when your body finally gives in, it's pure. No distractions, no illusions, just darkness and breath and surrender. You settle back now under your imaginary monastic blanket, straw rustling beneath you, the cold pressing in from all sides, and somewhere in the distance, far below, maybe even below the chapel, the castle continues its own strange breathing. Stillness in every stone, silence wrapped around silence, and in that silence sleep comes like a prayer answered. Night again, a real one this time, late, silent, and bone-deep cold. The kind of night that wraps around a stone castle like a vice, slipping through cracks in the mortar and creeping down the back of your neck no matter how many cloaks you're wearing. You're back in your chamber, staring into the fire that's decided, without asking, to die out 5 minutes ago. There's nothing left but embers now, faint and sulky, and the temperature is beginning to turn. The room sharpens. The air thickens. And just like that, you remember what people used to do when this moment came. When the fire faded, when the bed was still cold, and when you couldn't quite bring yourself to lie back down into a mattress that promised nothing but goosebumps and regret. You drank, not to party, not to celebrate, not even to numb yourself into a dreamless stupor. But because in the medieval world, drinking before bed was often a strategy for survival, the nightcap wasn't just a modern affectation. It had a long, storied past steeped in medicine, folklore, and the grim determination to make it through the night without shivering yourself into an early grave. You shuffle to the side table where a small clay bottle sits, plain, stout, and blessedly full. Its contents, a warm spiced ale, maybe a diluted mead, or, if your castle's physician is the experimental type, a truly suspicious herbal brew that smells like the apothecary's floor and tastes like someone's garden regrets. Either way, you pour a little into a cup and take a sip. It's sweet and sharp, not quite delicious, but oddly comforting. Heat flows down your throat like velvet wrapped around a dagger. In medieval castles, nighttime drinks were serious business. Depending on your rank and ailments, you might be served a variety of concoctions. Warmed wine with cloves and cinnamon, ale mixed with crushed fennel and thyme, or a more potent blend involving vinegar, honey, and a handful of mysterious cooling herbs someone swore would balance your humours. Every recipe was different, passed down through families or whispered by wandering healers, and every drink had a purpose, to help you sleep, warm your belly, keep bad dreams at bay, or simply dull the sharp edge of a winter night. Let's talk about the medical logic, such as it was. According to the prevailing theories of the time, based on the four humours, cold and wet were bad. Warm and dry were good. That meant the ideal sleeping body was gently heated and slightly dehydrated. A light drink before bed helped move you toward that balance. Too much? You'd tip the scale, wake in a sweat, or worse, be unable to rise for matins. Too little? You'd freeze, or worse, be declared melancholic, which was medieval shorthand for moody and definitely cursed. So there was a science to it, a ritual, something closer to a potion than a pleasure. Monks had their own versions, often using herbs grown in monastery gardens, valerian root, chamomile, sage and mugwort. Nobles preferred richer infusions, sometimes with imported spices from as far off as Byzantium or the Holy Land. And the poor? They did what they could. Warm beer if they had it, boiled water with a bit of stale bread if not. But the purpose was always the same, to chase away the cold, to slow the body and to invite sleep. In a castle where nothing came easy and nothing came cheap, a warm cup at night was a small grace. A signal that the worst of the day was over, that rest was possible. Maybe. Here's your slightly questionable fringe fact of the night. In some parts of medieval Europe, people believed certain night drinks could prevent demonic visitation. Yes, not only were you warming your bones, you were warding off evil. Some recipes called for holy water stirred into wine. Others included prayers or symbols carved into the cup itself. Superstition, sure, but when your castle is creaking, the wind sounds like a banshee, and someone down the hall just muttered Latin in their sleep, you start to appreciate any spiritual insurance you can get. Of course there were risks. Some medieval nightcaps were strong, really strong, and depending on who mixed them and what mood they were in, they could knock you out for hours, or leave you waking up disoriented, thirsty, and convinced you'd just seen St. Cuthbert standing at the foot of your bed. There are records of monks accidentally dosing themselves into full-blown visions, of nobles waking up in cold baths thinking that they were dead, and of servants who drank so much sleeping ale that they failed to rise for morning chores and were promptly assigned to latrine duty for a week. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether these drinks were actually effective in promoting better sleep or just a placebo wrapped in tradition. Some argue that the warm liquids and mild alcohol content did exactly what they were supposed to: soothe, relax, and heat the body. Others think the effect was more psychological, a comforting ritual in a world that offered few comforts. Either way, they worked often enough to become part of daily life. You take another sip, the warmth spreads, your shoulders ease, the stone floor doesn't feel quite as cruel underfoot anymore, and outside the wind howls against the window shutter like a lonely dog. You ignore it. You've got something better. You wander back to bed, cup in hand, and settle in slowly. The mattress sighs beneath you. You pull the covers over your legs, over your arms, over your neck. The mug rests warm in your palms, radiating peace. Maybe the herbs are already working, maybe it's just the placebo effect, but your eyelids feel heavier. Somewhere down the corridor another cup is being poured, a different blend, a different body shivering beneath different blankets, but the same need, the same ritual, because in a world made of stone and cold and long, dark hours, a warm drink wasn't just a luxury, it was protection, it was prayer, it was sleep, distilled. Tonight the castle is quieter than usual. Not silent, but quieter. The wind has eased, the shutters aren't rattling, the guard on the battlements isn't coughing his lungs out like he did last night. And below the hum of snoring and the occasional clink of shifting armour, there's a kind of hush that only comes when everyone, everywhere, is finally asleep. You lie in bed, blankets up to your nose, half dreaming, half thinking, and suddenly it hits you. The castle feels smaller tonight. Closer. Warmer, even. That's when you hear it. The softest shuffle of feet. Not soldiers, not ghosts, children. A door creaks down the hall. There's the faint tap of small feet on cold stone. The murmur of a sleepy voice asking for permission that probably isn't needed. Then the rustle of blankets, and a little thump as someone clambers into a bed that was already full. And just like that, it clicks. In a medieval castle, this was how children stayed warm. Not with separate nurseries, not with heated cribs, and definitely not with whatever decorative baby sleep sacks modern catalogues are selling. In the Middle Ages, warmth didn't come from gadgets or baby monitors. It came from bodies, from routine, from co-sleeping, not optional, not idealised, just normal. You pull your blanket tighter and imagine the chamber next door. The lord and lady tucked under layers of wool, already asleep. Then comes the first child, maybe 5 or 6, tiptoeing into the room, crawling in under the blankets like it's the most natural thing in the world. Then the second, younger still, half carried by a sleepy nursemaid, who immediately curls up near the hearth afterward. By morning, that bed will look like a particularly exhausted litter of foxes. All tails and elbows and tangled hair. It wasn't about sentiment. It was about strategy, because even in the grandest rooms of a castle, the cold came for everyone, and smaller bodies lose heat faster. So children, especially younger ones, slept with adults, not because of attachment parenting philosophies, but because medieval bedrooms weren't heated, and the cold didn't care how old you were. This wasn't just a noble custom either. In peasant cottages, it was even more pronounced. One bed, one family, all sleeping together like a pile of firewood, carefully arranged for maximum efficiency. Parents, children, grandparents, sometimes even cousins or neighbours in deep winter. Privacy was a fantasy, modesty negotiable. What mattered was surviving until spring. But in the castle, there were layers of both clothing and protocol. Nobility, especially, had rules about where children slept and with whom. Boys might be sent to sleep in adjoining rooms with tutors or squires in training. Girls might stay with a nursemaid or governess, but on the coldest nights, those barriers softened. A frightened child was often welcomed into the lord's bed without fuss, not as an exception but as tradition. And don't forget the servants. Nursemaids, wet nurses, and even child companions often slept in the same room, or even the same bed as their charges. You might have one adult and 2 or 3 children crammed under the same blanket, all wearing layers of linen shifts, socks and soft caps to keep the heat from escaping. And speaking of caps, yes, children wore them, some tiny floppy nightcaps tied under the chin, because in the medieval sleepwear hierarchy, your ears were always at risk. Here's a slightly adorable and slightly horrifying fringe fact. Some medieval children were swaddled so tightly in the winter months that they couldn't turn over or move their limbs. Think of it as medieval shrink wrapping. This was thought to help their bones grow straight, yes, but also to conserve body heat. Wrapped like little wool burritos, they were sometimes even hung in slings from bedposts or hearth hooks, like, well, you get the idea. Comfortable? Doubtful. Warm? Arguably. Now, scholars have long debated the emotional dynamics of this co-sleeping world. Was it affectionate? Practical? A bit of both? Some argue that co-sleeping reinforced bonds between parents and children, especially in a society where daylight hours were full of separation, lessons, chores, formal meals. Others suggest that while sleeping together did offer emotional closeness, it wasn't necessarily about that. It was just the only viable option in a freezing stone-walled world. You glance across your own room now, picturing how it might have looked centuries ago. A larger bed, certainly. Maybe even two smaller ones pushed together. Tapestries on every wall. A child-sized bench pulled near the fire. Perhaps a cradle, not rocking, but fixed on sturdy legs, and wrapped in so many furs you'd be forgiven for thinking a bear cub lived inside. And noise. So much nighttime noise. Babies crying, children murmuring in their sleep. The endless shuffle of feet as nursemaids adjusted blankets or refueled the brazier. The scrape of a chair, the drip of water from a roof beam. You didn't expect silence in a medieval castle. You expected life, even at rest. And yet, in all this chaos, there's comfort. Warmth, not as a luxury, but as a shared experience. Parents didn't need to lean over railings or check digital monitors. Their children were right there, under the same blanket, sharing the same breath, curled into the same heat pocket that kept everyone safe. You think about that now under your own covers. The simplicity of it. The raw, unfiltered practicality. No sleep training schedules. No cry-it-out debates. Just the quiet sound of someone small burrowing into your side because their feet were cold. And you'd grumble, you'd roll over, and then you'd fall asleep again, 2 degrees warmer. That was the deal. In the castle's great silence tonight, you can almost hear it. The soft breathing of families sleeping together. The rustle of shared sheets. The faintest thud of someone kicking a sibling in their sleep. The warmth of survival, built not with fire, but with closeness. It's not pretty, but it's enough. You've been asleep for hours when something wakes you. A prickling on the back of your neck, a sudden awareness that something is off. You don't know what time it is, not exactly, but the fire's long gone cold and the room has that particular chill that only sets in around the darkest part of the night. You lie still for a moment, listening. There's no wind tonight, no footsteps, no distant bells, just the faintest scratching sound. At first you think maybe it's a dream. Then it comes again, slow, deliberate, a soft tick, 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 somewhere under your mattress. You sigh, deeply, because you already know what this is. The bedbugs are back. Ah yes, just when you thought the cold, the noise, the shared sleeping spaces, and the lack of plumbing were bad enough. Here comes the final insult of medieval sleep, the infestation. Because no matter how noble your blood or how thick your feather bed, one thing that united lords, ladies, and labourers alike was this unavoidable truth. Something was probably crawling on them while they slept. You sit up and scratch at your arm, trying not to think about it too much. The itch isn't constant, just enough to remind you that you're not as alone as you'd hoped. That mattress beneath you, whether it's straw, feathers, or rushes, has been in use for years, possibly decades. You fluff it every few days, air it out when you can, even add lavender or wormwood to keep it fresh. But none of that guarantees peace. Because medieval beds, they were ecosystems. Let's start with the most infamous offender, the bedbug. These tiny vampires had been making themselves at home in bedding since ancient times, and medieval castles were prime real estate. Warm bodies, irregular cleaning schedules, and a total lack of chemical pest control made for an ideal environment. Once bedbugs found their way into a mattress, or a curtain, or a fur cloak, they multiplied. And they weren't shy. You'd wake up with little red bites along your arms or ankles, sometimes even on your neck, as if nature herself was mocking your attempt to survive another freezing night. And they weren't alone. There were fleas, of course. Everyone had fleas. People, dogs, cats. Probably even the furniture. If you were lucky, you'd just get a few harmless jumps here and there. If you were unlucky, you'd get the kind that liked to nest in bedding, multiplying in the seams of your mattress until your nights became an endless scratch fest. Some households kept special combs just for hunting them. Others tried rubbing garlic or vinegar into their sheets, but the fleas always came back. Then there were lice, head lice, body lice, even pubic lice, don't ask. These weren't strictly sleep-related pests, but they certainly made resting more difficult. And again, just like with fleas and bedbugs, the issue wasn't hygiene in the way we understand it today. Even the cleanest, most fastidiously washed person could end up infested simply by sharing a bed, or even a blanket, with the wrong companion, which in a castle where everyone shared everything was basically inevitable. Here's a fun little fringe fact for your midnight suffering. Some medieval folks slept with ferrets. Yes, actual ferrets trained or at least tolerated as living pest control. These fuzzy little assassins would think through bedding and rush mats in search of mice, and even the occasional large bug. Not exactly the snuggly bedmate you'd wish for, but in a castle full of chewing, scratching, biting invaders, a ferret was a welcome if slightly chaotic solution. Of course, the presence of pests didn't mean people gave up. They had methods, some effective, some not so much. Beds were sometimes taken apart and beaten with sticks, mattresses were dragged outside and aired on lines, weather permitting, and floors were strewn with fragrant herbs like tansy, rosemary or mint to try and mask smells and drive insects away. Certain nobles even commissioned beds made from tightly sealed wood with less space for bugs to hide, or hung fine netting, not for romance, but as a defensive measure. There's an academic debate here, unsurprisingly, about the actual severity of pest infestations in medieval sleeping arrangements. Some records suggest it was simply accepted as part of life, annoying but not catastrophic. Others point to the vast array of recipes, folk remedies, and church sermons warning against unclean living as evidence that infestations were widespread and deeply resented. The truth likely falls somewhere in the middle. For most people, pests were like the weather, miserable, unpredictable, and ultimately outside your control. You flop back onto your mattress, now trying not to think about what might be living in the straw beneath you. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. You adjust the blanket, scratch your ankle, and mentally debate whether it's worth waking the servant to get fresh linens. Then you remember it's 3 a.m. and she's probably curled up in the hallway with a ferret under her cloak. So you endure, because that's what medieval sleeping was in a nutshell. Not peaceful, not restorative, but endured. You learn to sleep through the scratch of bedbugs, the bite of fleas, the snore of someone beside you, the icy draught, the dripping ceiling, and the occasional crashing thunder of a castle cat launching itself onto a beam overhead. You learn to treat discomfort as background noise. You think of the old herbal remedy tucked under your pillow, lavender again. It helps a little. Not because it works on the bugs, but because it makes you feel like you're doing something. Like maybe this night will be slightly less itchy than the last. And tomorrow, you'll shake out the blanket, you'll toss the mattress if you're feeling brave. Maybe sprinkle a little ash along the bed frame. It's supposed to deter crawling things, or maybe you'll do nothing. Just get dressed and go about your day half scratched and half awake, like everyone else in the castle. Because in the Middle Ages, the bed wasn't a sanctuary, it was a battlefield. And tonight, you're just trying to make it until morning. Morning again, pale and damp, spilling weak sunlight over the frost-rimmed courtyard and the muddied boots lining the outer corridor. The castle smells like wood smoke, wet wool and cooked onions, which is about as close to perfume as it ever gets. You stretch under your blankets, scratch at a bite behind your knee, thanks again bedbugs, and groan. You're not cold exactly, not yet, but you know it's coming. The second your feet hit the floor, the chill will rise up your legs like a curse. Still, you've got no choice. You've got to move. Today you're travelling, which means your bed, the stiff, lumpy, vaguely flea-adjacent nest you've been enduring, might soon be a distant memory. Not because your next bed will be better, but because it might not exist at all. Because let's get something clear. Travelling in the Middle Ages was rarely warm, and it was almost never comfortable. Whether you were a noble on progress, a knight on campaign, or even a royal making the slow trek between castles, sleeping on the road was its own special circle of discomfort. Cold, loud, unpredictable, and deeply reliant on the ingenuity of your servants. You swing your legs out of bed and begin dressing layer by layer, woolen hose, linen underclothes, thick travelling cloak lined with fur that smells a little like yesterday's stable. You'll be on horseback most of the day, jostled over frost-rutted paths and muddy tracks, and tonight, if the gods are kind, you'll have a roof. If not, you'll make do, just like everyone else. So how did people sleep when they travelled? The short answer is, anywhere they could. If you were noble or wealthy, you might travel with a full entourage, including servants responsible for hauling your portable bed. Yes, your bed. Not just the linens, not just the mattress pad, but sometimes even the bed frame. It could be disassembled, carried on carts, and set up wherever you stopped for the night. It sounds extravagant, because it was, but remember, sleeping in the cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Pneumonia, frostbite, and hypothermia weren't yet in the medical textbooks, but they were on everyone's mind. The travelling bed itself was usually simpler than a castle bed, often just a canvas cot or a folding frame topped with straw or a thin feather mattress, rolled tight for transport. And forget private rooms. You'd be set up in the hall of a host's manor, a crowded roadside inn, or, if you were lucky, a priory. Space was shared, noise was constant, and bedding had to be layered fast and torn down faster. That's where warming pans came in. Imagine arriving to your lodgings, half frozen, and finding your bed, stiff with cold, the sheets damp with chill. Before you crawl in, a servant takes a long-handled brass pan filled with hot embers from the hearth and runs it between the sheets, back and forth, quick but careful. If they do it right, the bed is warm and dry. If they do it wrong, the sheets scorch, or worse, ignite. There are a few historical accounts of this happening, which you should not read if you ever plan to sleep again. Still, these warming pans were considered indispensable for the travelling elite. Some households even had embroidered pans, or pans engraved with religious symbols, as if St. Catherine herself was going to protect your bedding from spontaneous combustion. The less wealthy, of course, had no such luxuries. They relied on cloaks, dogs, and body heat. And when all else failed, they slept in their clothes, under their horses' blankets, curled near the dying embers of a fire that wasn't quite big enough for everyone. Let's not forget the inns, those rare, glorious havens that dot the trade routes and pilgrim trails. If you arrived early enough, you might get a bed. If you arrived late, a spot on the floor, maybe under a table, maybe near the kitchen, sometimes with a goat. The bed itself would be shared, absolutely. And who your bedfellow was depended on timing and luck. A fellow noble, maybe. A suspicious merchant, possibly. A monk with a snoring problem and an affection for garlic, almost certainly. And yes, there were travelling tents, particularly for nobles, knights, and royalty during military campaigns. Some were extravagant, wood-framed, painted with family crests, filled with bedding, tapestries, and even small braziers to hold coals. It's hard to overstate how luxurious these were. Picture a portable room in the middle of a muddy field, complete with rugs, chairs, and enough wine to forget the war entirely. But not everyone travelled like that. For many, a tent meant a bit of canvas stretched between trees, with the ground as your mattress and the sky as your ceiling. Here's your strange but true fact for the night. Some noble women travelled with their own bedroom furniture. Not just the bed, but folding chairs, stools, and even chamber pots with fitted lids, painted, gilded, and sometimes monogrammed. One Italian duchess reportedly refused to travel without her astrologer, her geese, and her mattress, because apparently even centuries ago some people were very serious about their sleep setup. There's academic debate over how often these mobile comfort rituals were used. Some historians suggest only the top percent of the top percent had the resources to move their beds like circus caravans. Others argue that many wealthy households owned campaign furniture, beds and chairs built specifically for travel, disassembling like medieval IKEA kits. The likeliest truth? Most nobles found a middle ground. Bring what you can, bribe the host, and accept that you're going to be cold, itchy, and angry by sunrise. You pull on your gloves now, stiff with age but warm enough, and head toward the stables. Outside, the frost has turned the ground silver. Your horse stamps in place, breath clouding the morning air. A servant ties your travelling packs down, one filled with cloaks, the other with wrapped bundles of bedding. You've brought your favourite blanket, and a warming stone if there's time to heat it. You nod to your steward. He nods back. You're ready to leave behind your bed of straw and bugs, ready to embrace the moving misery that is travel sleep, ready to curl up in an unfamiliar room beside unfamiliar people, with your cloak for a pillow and your boot for a hot water bottle. Because in the Middle Ages, travel didn't stop for winter, and sleep didn't stop for anyone. The road has been long and you're exhausted, not just physically, but that deeper medieval kind of exhaustion that settles in your bones like dampness. You've ridden through sleet, through ankle-deep mud, and across terrain so uneven it rattled your spine into a question mark. Your clothes are stiff with travel. Your boots, despite being stuffed with extra wool, are soaked. And now, finally, as the sun disappears behind the jagged hills and the castle where you're supposed to spend the night looms on the horizon, you're thinking of one thing and one thing only: heat. Specifically, how to generate it. Because you've already accepted that this guest chamber will be cold, that the bedding will smell like someone else's dog, and that the fire will be little more than a polite pile of coals when you arrive. But tonight, you've come prepared. You've brought something special, something curious, something your local alchemist swears will revolutionize travel sleep. It's a stone, But not just any stone. This one is smooth, round, and silkscone specially chosen for its abilities to hold heat. You remove it from your saddlebag like it's the crown jewels, then wrap it carefully in thick cloth before handing it to your steward with a single command: into the fire. Welcome to the strange, half-magical, half-scientific world of medieval heat hacks, an evolving collection of tricks, tools, and half-baked ideas that people tried, tested, and sometimes barely survived in their efforts to stay warm through long, freezing nights. Your hot stone, let's start there, was one of the more effective tricks. Once thoroughly warmed in the hearth, it could be wrapped and placed beneath your bedding. It radiated heat for hours, sometimes well into the night. Some people placed it at the foot of the bed to warm their legs. Others used smaller ones to cradle in their hands or tuck against their stomachs like a primitive heating pad. If you were clever, you'd rotate them, one in the fire, one in the bed, switching them out like some slow-motion thermal ballet. Alchemists, those oddball scientists of the medieval world, loved this kind of thing. They didn't just hand you hot rocks, they theorized about them. They believed in the mystical properties of certain stones. Basalt for holding heat, soapstone for slow release, even quartz, which one particularly ambitious herbalist swore could absorb the sun's fire. Whether any of this was true didn't matter. If it stayed warm, you used it, and the innovations didn't stop there. Some households experimented with heated bricks, especially in monasteries or manor houses where tiled floors could be deadly cold. These bricks would be baked in the kitchen oven during the day and laid under rush mats or beneath the bed frame at night. They didn't offer the direct heat of a hot stone, but they helped fight off the creeping chill that rose up from the floor like an invisible tide. Then there were the more experimental options. Let's talk about hand warmers. Picture a small iron box, no bigger than your palm, filled with embers and suspended on a tiny chain or wooden handle. People would clutch these before bed or keep them under their cloaks on cold rides. Some were beautifully crafted, covered in punched designs that allowed the heat to escape slowly. Others were improvised, made from old lantern frames or soup tins. The problem? They were, well, open flames in your lap or your bed. This brings us to your fringe fact of the evening. A handful of late medieval alchemists attempted to create ever-hot stones. They claimed to have developed a mineral mixture that, once heated, would retain warmth indefinitely. One German record from the 15th century describes a star-forged stone that could boil water by thought alone. Unsurprisingly, it vanished somewhere between the second and third cup of mead and was never seen again. But for a brief candlelit moment, the dream of the medieval hot battery was real. For the average castle dweller, though, the trick was combining small comforts. You'd heat your stone, you'd place it under the bed, then you'd pull your wool blankets over it, trapping the warmth like a makeshift oven. If you were extra desperate, you might even huddle near the embers of the fire itself, though this came with the risk of waking up coughing, or worse, having a face full of ash and the distinct sense that you'd singed your eyebrows in your sleep. There's a scholarly debate about just how widespread these warming practices were. Some argue that such heat tools were luxury items, reserved for the wealthy or the well-connected. Others suggest they were more common than we assume, especially in rural areas where the knowledge of warming stones and basic chemistry passed from hearth to hearth like treasured secrets. Modern archaeologists have even uncovered scorched stones and charred fabrics near medieval hearths, possibly remnants of this very practice. But as always, practicality won out. If it made the bed warm, if it kept the children from crying, if it let you sleep 1 hour longer without waking to numb fingers, you used it. Whether it was grounded in alchemy, folk magic, or just years of trial and error, medieval people were nothing if not creative when it came to keeping the cold at bay. Back in your chamber, the stone is ready. It glows faintly orange around the edges as it's lifted carefully from the fire with tongs, then wrapped tightly in a thick wool cloth. Your steward sets it at the foot of your bed, under the coverlet. Almost immediately you feel the warmth bloom through the fabric. It's not much, not compared to modern heating, but in this moment, it feels like a miracle. Your toes uncurl, your legs stop trembling. You exhale, long and slow. Later, as you slide under the blankets and settle into the shallow groove your body makes in the mattress, you marvel at how something so simple could make such a difference. A stone, a cloth, a little fire, and for the first time in days, sleep feels possible. Not inevitable, but possible, which in the Middle Ages is about as good as it gets. You wake in the dark as usual, though this time you're warmer than you expected to be. Your legs are toasty, the blanket's holding some residual heat, and you even managed a few hours of uninterrupted sleep without bugs, barks, or bells. That little stone you tucked under the blankets, worth its weight in gold, but now, as you rise slowly from your travelling bed, you feel something else. Something not made of wool or fire or hot rocks. The castle itself. You glance around the unfamiliar chamber, its stone walls slick with a cold sheen of early morning damp. A few faded tapestries hang awkwardly beside a window slit, the glass so thin it might as well be air. Your breath fogs as you move toward it, drawn by instinct or curiosity, or the faintest hope of sun, and as you look out over the grey hills and early light, you realise something you hadn't fully appreciated until now. This castle was designed to fight winter. Not just the people in it, not just the clothes and bedding and desperate nighttime drinks, but the building itself, the architecture, the layout, the stubborn, clever ways that stone was carved and placed not just to keep out arrows and raiders, but to outwit the cold. Take a good look around. This place is a fortress, yes, but also a kind of thermal maze, engineered to make freezing slightly less inevitable. And it starts with the walls. Thick, sometimes as much as 10 feet deep, these stone monsters weren't just for show. They absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly through the night, like enormous immovable hot water bottles. Except, less cosy. Still, they provided insulation in the only way people knew how, sheer mass. You run your fingers along the windowsill, cold of course, but you notice how small the window itself is. Barely wider than your hand, not a mistake, that was on purpose. Smaller windows meant less exposure to wind, less opportunity for heat to escape, and fewer chances for winter to snake its fingers inside. And if you had the resources, those tiny openings were sometimes covered with horn, not glass. Thinly shaved animal horn panels, oiled and translucent, just enough to let in light without letting in the weather. You glance up, the ceiling is low, especially compared to the soaring halls downstairs. That's no accident either. Low ceilings trap heat. A small sleeping chamber meant a smaller space to warm. And you may have noticed that important rooms, like bedrooms, studies and private chapels, were often built on upper floors, not just for defence but for thermal strategy. Heat rises. If there's a fire burning below, even in the kitchens or great hall, that warmth eventually drifts upward. A few degrees, sure, but in a medieval winter, a few degrees can be the difference between tolerable and frostbite. There's more. Notice the spiral staircases, always turning to the right. That served both military and thermal purposes. In battle, it gave right-handed defenders the advantage. But those tight turns and narrow passages also slowed airflow, keeping drafts from racing through the building. Likewise, castle builders often tucked doors and stairwells into recesses or behind thick curtains, not just to look dramatic, but to stop warm air from escaping into the stone wilderness beyond. And let's not forget the materials themselves. That stone, limestone, granite, sandstone, whatever they could quarry nearby, was chosen for durability, but it had unintended thermal properties. It held onto heat slowly and released it even slower. That's why fires were constantly stoked, why rushes were thrown on the floor, and why every single person in the building learned to find the one corner where the heat actually settled. But all of this came with trade-offs. Yes, castles were more heat efficient than a barn, but they weren't warm. They weren't cosy. They were better than nothing. A little warmer than outdoors, less deadly than a forest, but not by much, and when winter hit hard, when snow piled against the outer walls and the wind whipped across the battlements, no amount of clever stonework was enough. That's when the fires roared. That's when the beds were crowded. That's when tapestries were layered 3 deep and windows were sealed with boards and beeswax. Here's your historical oddity of the night. Some castle designers experimented with solar alignment. Yep, medieval green architecture. Certain rooms were built facing south to absorb maximum sunlight. Courtyards were sometimes placed to trap heat, using high walls and angled construction to catch sun and cut wind. One 14th century document even suggests building a lord's solar, to draw in the light from morning till eventide as a lizard might sun himself upon the stones. No idea if that was meant poetically or literally, but it shows how aware they were. Cold was the enemy and architecture was the weapon. There's debate among historians about just how intentional all of this was. Some argue that much of medieval castle design was about defence first, and any heating benefits were just happy accidents. Others point to repeated patterns, room placement, materials, curtain walls, covered walkways, as evidence of a growing awareness of thermal design. Either way, there's no question that castle builders thought beyond the sword. They thought about the seasons, about sleep, about survival. You step away from the window now, your breath still fogging the air. The chamber's no warmer, really. The fire is just embers, but you feel impressed, a little bit awed. Because while you've spent so much time layering clothes and sipping questionable herbal brews and battling bedbugs, you didn't fully appreciate that the building itself was on your side. It wasn't perfect, but it was trying to keep you alive, trying to keep the heat in, trying in its own way to let you sleep. So tonight, when you lie back on that uneven mattress with its damp corners and suspicious lumps, you do it with a new kind of gratitude. Not for the bed, not for the blankets, but for the walls, because in a castle it's the walls that watch over you. Stone, wind-worn, older than memory, and just warm enough to matter. You're back in your own chamber now, several days and many cold miles later. The travelling stone has cooled, your boots are still drying by the hearth, and your bed looks both comforting and slightly suspicious. Like it's been holding grudges while you were away. You drop your cloak onto a nearby bench, flex your aching shoulders, and let out a breath that's half exhaustion, half satisfaction. You survived. Again. But tonight, as you peel off your woolen hose and lower yourself into the bed with a satisfying creak, there's a new thought lingering at the edge of your mind. Not about the cold, not even about the bugs, but about the noise, because for all the tricks, traditions and tactics you've learnt to manage the temperature, there's one thing medieval castles never fully mastered. Sleeping in peace, the castle is alive, not metaphorically, not romantically, literally. It is a breathing, groaning, fidgeting animal made of stone and wood and echo. And once you start to hear it, you can't unhear it. It begins with the beams. They creak. Not gently, not sweetly. No, they shift like old knees and stretch like tired backs. Wooden supports, those grand arching ribs of the ceiling, moan as they expand and contract in the cold. Sometimes it sounds like a footstep overhead, other times like a low animal cry. And for one unforgettable hour last winter, you swore you heard a whisper directly above your head until you realised it was just wind slipping through a warped joint in the rafters. Probably. Next comes the scratching. Soft, worried, irregular. That's likely. Mice, definitely. Something larger and furrier with extremely bad timing. Don't think about it. Between the walls, under the floor, behind the tapestries, something is always moving. Scavenging for crumbs, nesting in the rushes, possibly reenacting a full social drama involving mouse marriages and cheese politics. Either way, the castle is a rodent playground, and those sounds are your lullaby. Then there's the wind. It's never silent. It doesn't matter how well fortified the castle is, how thick the walls are, or how tightly the shutters have been latched. Wind finds a way. It snakes through arrow slits and door gaps. It whistles under floorboards. It rattles panes of horn and oiled parchment with the fury of a bard rejected at court. Sometimes it howls, rising and falling like a chant from the moors. Other times, it sighs so quietly you're not sure if it's outside the wall or inside your head. And people, God, the people, castles aren't private, even if you're a noble, even if you have your own chamber. There are footsteps in the hall at all hours. Servants fetching water, guards changing shifts, a steward who walks like he's angry at the floor. Then there's the coughing, someone always has a cough. A wet one, a dry one, a cough that sounds suspiciously like it's coming from just outside your door, even though you told them to sleep on the far side of the corridor. You pull your blanket tighter, curl onto your side and try to focus on the fire, which pops softly in the hearth. But now the crackling reminds you of that time a torch in the stable started spitting sparks and the hayloft caught fire. You sat up for 3 nights after that, half expecting the flames to climb through your floorboards. There's a part of you that longs for silence. True, blanketed silence, but in a medieval castle, silence is suspicious. Silence means something's wrong, it means someone's missing, or someone's sneaking, or the wind has gone still before a storm. So you adjust. You start to crave the sounds you once cursed. You learn the language of noise, that dragging sound near your door, probably the chambermaid's slipper, that dull thud from upstairs, the steward's footlocker, that soft drip, drip, drip behind the wall. Rain seeping through a crack that no one's gotten around to fixing since last autumn, or possibly the start of a full-blown leak that'll soak your bedding by morning. Who knows? Here's your delightfully miserable fringe fact for the evening. Some medieval castle residents took to sleeping with cloths or wax plugs stuffed in their ears to drown out the noise. Not because they were delicate, but because between the wind, the livestock, the bells, the servants, the roosters that didn't understand time, and the occasional midnight duel or childbirth, it was simply the only way to get any rest. Of course, it meant you couldn't hear intruders or fires starting. Hey, trade-offs. There's scholarly debate about how well medieval people actually slept. Some argue that constant noise, poor conditions, and unpredictable disruptions meant most people existed in a perpetual state of mild sleep deprivation. Others suggest that people adjusted over time, developing deeper sleep habits that could withstand the chaos around them. After all, when you've known nothing else, when you've never heard true silence, does the noise even register? You roll over now, trying to find that one sweet spot in the mattress that doesn't feel like a sack of turnips. Outside, a distant dog barks. Someone answers with a thrown boot and a curse in Old French. The wind starts up again, dragging its fingers along the shutter like it's trying to write a message in dust. You close your eyes. It's loud, of course it's loud, but it's your kind of loud now. Familiar, predictable, almost comforting. Because at least when the castle's this noisy, you know it's still standing, still alive. And somehow, in the middle of the scratching and creaking and coughing and rustling and moaning, you fall asleep. Not all at once, not peacefully, but enough to dream. The dream you were having was strange. Something about trying to light a fire with a spoon while a monk lectured you on proper sock storage. But it's gone now, vanished the second you blink awake and stare into the inky dark of your room. Something's wrong. Not dramatically wrong, there's no shouting, no alarms, no flames licking at the rafters, but there's a feeling, a shift, the kind of quiet that wraps too tight around your skin. The fire's out. The shutters are still, your breath fogs in the air. But that's not what's bothering you. No, it's something deeper. You reach a hand under the blanket and confirm it. Your feet are freezing. And not just cold, we're talking sharp, numbing ice brick feet that feel like they've been dipped in snowmelt and then sealed in iron. No amount of shifting or toe wiggling helps. It's like they've given up on circulation entirely. You groan and roll onto your back, debating whether to reheat the stone or just pretend you don't need feet anymore. But as you stare at the dark ceiling, gritting your teeth and mourning the loss of 10 perfectly good toes, it hits you. This is exactly why people used to sleep in shifts. Not work shifts, sleep shifts, because in the Middle Ages, people didn't always sleep all the way through the night. Not because of insomnia or noisy neighbours, but because that wasn't how sleep worked, at least not back then. Welcome to the mysterious half-forgotten world of segmented sleep, or what some historians call first sleep and second sleep. For much of the medieval period, sleeping in one long uninterrupted block wasn't the standard. Instead, people would go to bed not long after nightfall, sleep for a few hours, wake up for a bit, and then go back to sleep again until dawn. You stretch your legs, trying in vain to reintroduce blood flow, and picture it. The entire castle, guards, cooks, nobles, servants, all nestled into their beds for first sleep. A few hours pass, then slowly, like fish rising to the surface, they begin to stir. Not everyone, not all at once, but in enough numbers that it becomes a thing. People wake, they sit up, they stoke the fire, they talk, they pray, some write, some even visit neighbours, tiptoeing down drafty halls for a quiet chat or, more scandalously, a late-night rendezvous under the pretense of discussing goat prices. It sounds strange now, but it was completely normal. In fact, it was expected. There are references in medieval literature, court records, even medical texts that treat this waking period as a natural part of the night. Doctors recommended using it for quiet reflection or prayer. Religious texts praised the wakeful hours as ideal for spiritual clarity. Farmers might use the time to check on animals or prepare for the next day. And if you happen to share a bed with someone, well, this was also considered an appropriate window for, shall we say, marital negotiations. Here's a curious little fact. Many of the recorded nighttime prayers from this period were written specifically for the time between sleeps. Monks had entire routines built around these hours, rising for matins in the dead of night, reciting psalms by candlelight while the rest of the world dozed through their first or manned slumber. Even secular folk observed the rhythm. You weren't disturbed by waking, you expected it. Of course, there's a scholarly debate about how widespread segmented sleep truly was. Some argue it was more common in rural areas or among the deeply religious. Others suggest it was nearly universal before artificial lighting became common. The general theory is that once candles, oil lamps, and eventually gas and electric lights allowed people to extend their days, our sleep began to compress into a single uninterrupted block. Before that, the natural darkness encouraged this two-part sleep, timed neatly with the body's circadian rhythms and the flickering life of firelight. Back in your room, you sigh and finally sit up, pulling the blanket around your shoulders like a sad, sleepy cloak. The room's colder than before. You consider lighting the fire again, but the thought of leaving the blanket bubble makes your spine curl in protest. So instead, you do what medieval people often did during this middle-of-the-night wakefulness. You think, not in a productive way. You're not solving equations or mapping trade routes, more like slow, wandering thoughts. Did you leave your gloves in the stable? What did the cook mean when she said the stew was haunted? Is it possible the firewood is cursed? That sort of thing. Eventually you stand, quietly, your feet complain every step of the way, but you move to the window and peek through the shutter. The world outside is velvet dark, the stars smeared across the sky like milk. No lights, no torches, just a lone figure walking the parapet, one of the guards bundled in a fur cloak pacing to stay awake. You feel a strange kinship with him, because here you are, awake in the middle of the night, not because something is wrong, but because that's how it's supposed to be. Maybe your body remembers, maybe some old ancestral part of you is still tuned to the rhythm of the past. First sleep, waking, second sleep. A forgotten cadence still humming softly in the background of your modern brain. Eventually you return to bed. You rub your feet together for heat, pull the blanket back up to your ears, and close your eyes. And somewhere between the creak of the rafters and the faint snore of the guard dog downstairs, your mind loosens. Your breathing slows, and you slip into your second sleep, just like they used to. Morning arrives not with sunlight, but with noise. You're half dreaming something about trying to knit a blanket out of firewood when it begins. First, a clang of iron somewhere deep in the castle like a dropped bucket echoing through a stairwell. Then the usual percussion of boots on stone, voices rising like the world itself is being shaken awake. You try to cling to the edge of second sleep, but it's slipping fast. Someone opens a door down the corridor, something heavy is dragged, and finally, as always, a rooster that clearly does not know what time it is, lets out a confused crow so loud and broken it might actually be cursed. You give up. Pulling back the blanket, you sit upright and feel the full weight of the morning settle onto your shoulders like a wet cloak. Your neck aches. Your hip has a new complaint. And even though your feet stayed attached during the night, they feel like they barely survived it. Still, the room is warmer now. The coals in the hearth have smoldered into a faint heat that's just enough to take the edge off. A small win. As you move about the room, stiff but functional, a servant enters, without knocking, of course, because medieval privacy is mostly theoretical, and begins the ritual of the morning. She throws open the shutter, just wide enough to let in a shaft of fog. No sun today, just clouds as thick as wool, and a sky that seems to hang only a few feet above the rooftops. She sets down a basin of cold water and a cloth that looks like it died 3 washings ago. You nod in thanks, groan as you stand and begin the slow process of transforming yourself from half-frozen bed creature into something resembling a functioning human being. This, too, was part of the sleep cycle. Waking wasn't a clean break in the Middle Ages, it was a ritual. A long, slow transition from sleep to day, often stretched over hours. There was no alarm clock, no single moment that declared, "You are now awake." You eased into it. You were woken by bells or servants or the chill itself, but even then you didn't leap out of bed. You adjusted, you sat, you muttered, you listened to your joints crunch. You might even have prayed. Prayer, in fact, was often the very first act of the day, especially for nobles and clergy. A whispered "Our Father." A touch of holy water if you had any on your nightstand. Some people kept small devotional books near their bed, the kind you could flip through with one eye still closed, hoping to earn divine favour before you even found your shoes. And shoes, they were a commitment. You couldn't just shuffle around in socks or barefoot, not unless you wanted frostbite or tetanus from some stray nail in the rushes. So you pulled on your hose, tugged up your chausses, and then battled your way into stiff leather boots with buckles that always seemed tighter in the morning. Your fringe fact for today? Some medieval nobles had wake-up assistants. No, seriously. Their job was to enter quietly before dawn, stoke the fire, warm a cloth, and then gently rouse their lord or lady with a whispered greeting, and sometimes even a cup of warm spiced wine. If that sounds wildly luxurious, remember, the same person probably had to clean the chamber pot an hour later, so let's not get too jealous. You wander over to the basin and splash your face with the kind of cold water that makes your ancestors blink inside your skull. It's shocking, yes, but also oddly clarifying. Your eyes feel clearer, your headache dulls a little, and your sense of place, that liminal space between dream and day, finally fades. There's something to be said for these slow mornings. No screens, no blaring alarms, just time, a chance to recalibrate. You're not expected to run straight to a task. Breakfast won't be for another hour, so instead you sit by the window, still wrapped in half your blanket, and watch as the courtyard begins to fill with life. A stable boy chases a chicken that has, yet again, decided to join the pigsty. A maid shakes out a blanket from the upper gallery. 2 guards pass, laughing at something in low voices, and across the way smoke begins curling from the kitchen chimney, sweet, thick, and unmistakably buttery. You'll eat soon, likely something hot and heavy. Porridge if you're lucky, leftover meat stew if the kitchen's particularly cruel. But for now, you sip from the cup your servant brings, thin ale with a few floating herbs, a kind of liquid breakfast warming, if not exactly refreshing. It hits your stomach like a small bag of stones, which is frankly exactly what you need. And then, only then, does the full waking process complete. You stretch, roll your shoulders, and begin the day in earnest. Maybe you'll meet with the steward, maybe you'll check the condition of the granary or oversee the repairs on the outer wall. But whatever happens, you'll do it on a few hours of segmented sleep, one warm stone, a prayer, and the faint ache of a straw mattress pressed into your spine. There's a debate among modern historians about whether medieval sleep was better or worse than ours. Some say we're overworked and underslept, always staring into blue light and chasing REM cycles like a medieval peasant chasing his last chicken. Others point out that back then sleep was constantly interrupted, by cold, by pests, by prayer bells and drafty windows, and the basic fact that your mattress could possibly catch fire if you got too cozy. The truth? It's complicated. Medieval people didn't expect perfection. Sleep wasn't sacred. It wasn't engineered for optimal health and performance. It was survival. It was necessary. It was something you worked around. Something you improved in small, clever ways. An extra layer of wool, a hot drink, a stone by the fire, a body next to yours. You stand now, fully dressed, and open the door to your chamber. The hallway smells like stew and soot and something faintly floral, possibly an herbal sachet nailed to the wall. Your breath is no longer fogging. Your spine has settled. And despite everything, despite the bugs and the cold and the creaking beam and the suspicious snoring, you slept. Not perfectly, but enough. And in a medieval castle, that's victory. Evening again, though this one feels different, softer, quieter. The kind of dusk that doesn't crash in with howling wind or sheets of ice slamming the shutters, but seeps gently into the castle like warm ink soaking a page. The hearth has been kind to you today, still flickering with orange coals that haven't needed much coaxing. The blankets are layered just right. 2 thick wool, 1 fur, and the scratchy but warm quilt from the storage chest you finally remembered to raid. Your feet, miraculously, are not frozen. And as you settle into bed for what might be a full night's sleep, you feel something unexpected. You feel okay. Not good, not luxurious, definitely not spa weekend refreshed. But for once, the bed doesn't feel like a punishment, the room doesn't feel like a cave, and the castle doesn't feel like it's trying to kill you. You've adapted. Or at least you've stopped resisting. That counts for something. As you lie there, staring up at the wooden beams overhead, your mind drifts. Not to what's wrong or cold or itching, but to the bigger picture. The strange, deeply human rhythm of medieval sleep. This wasn't just about staying warm. It wasn't just about bedbugs and braziers and hot drinks and windproofing. This was about survival and routine and the deeply weird, deeply clever ways people carved out rest in a world that never made it easy. Because castles weren't designed for sleep. They were designed for defense, for intimidation, for symbolism. Sleep was a side effect. Something you squeezed in between siege drills and feasts and freezing drafts slicing through the arrow slits. But despite that, people still made it work. They found patterns, made rituals, turned firewood and fleas, and layered wool into a functioning system of nightly rest. And it wasn't just the nobles, the entire castle, from the lord in his feathered canopied bed to the kitchen boy curled near the bread ovens, had its own language of sleep. The guards took turns napping on stone benches between shifts. The servants slept wherever there was warmth, sometimes still in their work clothes. The steward probably slept sitting up half awake, ears trained for the slightest sound of disaster. And yet they all did it. Every night, in winter, in storms, in hunger, and in war, and in plague years, and in long, lean Februaries, when every gust of wind felt like it carried death in its teeth. That's the part you never really think about until you're living it. Sleep in the Middle Ages wasn't optional. It was strategy. Sleep schedules were dictated by seasons, work, social class, even religion. In summer, you might get 4 hours at night and make up the rest with a midday nap. In winter, you chased warmth and darkness like twin-born gods. You woke for prayers, then slept again. You rose early to start the fires, then napped when you could. You didn't schedule sleep. You fit it around the margins of your life, tucking it in between duties like an afterthought. And still, they had dreams. There's something beautifully ironic about that. Despite the physical misery, the lack of comfort, and the near-constant noise, medieval people dreamed. They recorded dreams in journals, in letters, in confessionals. Some believed dreams were messages from God. Others thought them meaningless, but many, especially mystics, monks, and chroniclers, took dreams seriously. Even the common folk passed down stories about dream omens and warnings. Which means even in the worst beds, the worst nights, the worst drafts, people still had enough rest to let their minds wander. Float, invent, is one of the great two human contradictions. Give a straw, lice, and a mattress that smells like wet hay, and we'll still find a way to hallucinate a talking deer that tells us to build a chapel. Tonight, you find yourself thinking about all of this. Not from an academic angle, but from a quiet, in-bed, half-tired sense of wonder. You've felt the weight of a fur blanket on your chest. You've tasted the weird, spicy wine meant to knock you out. You've sat by the fire, turning a hot stone in your hands like a secret spell. You've walked the corridors at midnight and listened to the castle breathe around you. And somehow, despite every discomfort, you've learned to sleep. Not because it's perfect, but because it's human. You've become part of a pattern older than the mortar in these walls. Here's your final quirky fact of the night. Some medieval households had official sleepers. Yes, actual people hired to test the warmth of beds before a noble lay down in them. Think of it as the medieval version of quality control. If the bed was too cold, too damp, too alive with things that shouldn't be, the sleeper would alert the steward. Or, if they were particularly devoted to their job, or terrified of their employer, they'd just lay there until the mattress was warm enough to hand off. Talk about unsung heroes of history. Historians have only recently started digging into the nuance of medieval sleep. For years, it was overlooked. Too domestic, too unglamorous. But now we're starting to understand just how much effort went into resting. How sleep shaped architecture, daily schedules, even food. How much of surviving a winter in a castle depended not on bravery or wealth, but on cleverness, on knowing how to trap heat, how to share warmth, how to trust the rhythms of the night. You're pulling the blanket higher now. The fire's almost out, but the coals are still giving off just enough light to silhouette the beams above you, casting slow, flickering shadows. Your limbs feel heavy, but in a good way, the kind of heavy that comes from muscle and ritual and well-earned sleep. Outside, the wind is quiet. No storms tonight, just the distant sound of hooves in the lower yard, fading quickly. Someone arriving late, or leaving early, it doesn't matter. Because you're here, wrapped in warmth that wasn't easy to earn, resting in a bed that once felt like punishment, now claimed as your own, listening to a castle that for once has nothing more to ask of you. So you close your eyes, and sleep comes easily. The castle sleeps with you. So now, with the fire gone to embers and the last of the candle stubs flickering out on their own terms, we've reached the quiet part. You made it. Through the cold, through the noise, through the itchy straw mattresses, the wandering livestock, the middle-of-the-night ghost thoughts, and the kind of bone-deep medieval fatigue that made even a pest-ridden featherbed feel like a luxury. You've slept with hot stones. You've bargained with warming pans. You've negotiated peace treaties with your own toes. And somehow, here at the end of it all, you're still here. Not just surviving sleeping. Maybe not the kind of sleep that comes with perfect silence and high thread counts and down duvets fluffed by invisible hands, but the kind of sleep you earn. Sleep that settles into your bones because it has nowhere else to go. Sleep that doesn't ask for comfort, it creates it. Bit by bit, layer by layer, like wool, like stone, like tradition. And now, as the castle curls around you in the final hush before dawn, it's easy to see how they did it. How they slept in towers and keeps, in chambers and closets, in stables and solars and servants' corners. Not because it was easy, but because sleep always finds a way. Even in the cold, even in the dark, even in a world made of stone and silence and superstition. So breathe deep. Let the cold stay outside the walls, and let the weight of wool and history hold you here. Good night, traveller, and sweet dreams.